Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're pulling the thread on someone quite unexpected in the grand tapestry of medieval emperors. Otto IV. He was Holy Roman Emperor from 1209 to 1218.
And what makes him so fascinating, really, is where he came from. You think Holy Roman Emperor, you think German heartland, right?
Yeah, right.
But Otto, he was basically a product of the English court. Raised within the Angevin world, that sprawling empire of Henry II and Richard the Lionheart, he's the only German king ever from the Welf dynasty. Some even call him, maybe provocatively, Germany's first foreign king.
That really flips the script. A king of the Romans, later emperor, whose early life, his money, his military experience, it's all tied up with England and France, not really Germany. So our mission today is to trace this incredible, almost unbelievable rise from an English royal ward to emperor in Rome. But just as importantly, we need to unpack his, well, spectacular downfall. It really boils down to him picking a fight he just couldn't win against Pope Innocent III, arguably the most powerful pope of the era.
Absolutely. And to get a handle on Otto, you really have to look at his career through the lens of three major conflicts, which your sources detail pretty well. First, there's the long civil war against his rival, Philip of Swabia, then the big one, that disastrous clash with Pope Innocent III, and finally, it all culminates in this military catastrophe against the King of France, Philip II.
It sounds like a perfect storm.
It really is. It shows how international connections can rocket someone to the top, but also how political deals and maybe just bad geopolitical calls can bring it all crashing down fast.
Okay, let's start at the beginning with this very international background. Otto IV, born around 1175, his father was Henry the Lion, a huge figure, Duke of Bavaria and Saxony, his mother Matilda of England. So why does the son of such a powerful German duke end up being raised across the channel?
Well, it wasn't really a choice, more a necessity. Henry the Lion had a major falling out with the emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, a big one. By 1182, Henry was actually banished from the Holy Roman Empire. Political exile.
Ah, okay. So that explains it.
Right. So young Otto gets sent off to England to be raised under the wing of his maternal grandfather, King Henry II. And we're not talking about a summer visit. This was his upbringing. Total immersion in the English court.
And the Angevin court, under Henry II and later Richard I, that wasn't just England, was it? It was this vast network covering England and huge chunks of France.
Exactly, from Scotland down to the Pyrenees. So Otto grew up speaking French, the language of that court, as well as German. He wasn't being groomed as just another German duke. He was becoming essentially an Angevin loyalist, part of that whole system.
And his key relationship seems to have been with his uncle, Richard the Lionheart.
Definitely. Richard really took him under his wing, saw him almost as a foster son. And Richard was clearly trying to use Otto to extend his own influence, particularly on the continent. He kept trying to set Otto up with land and titles.
The first big attempt was the Earldom of York, back in 1190. That sounds like a pretty major English title.
It was huge, a massive grant on paper.
Yeah.
But it fell flat, completely.
Why? What happened?
The local vassals in Yorkshire basically said no thanks. They disputed the grant, maybe questioned its legitimacy, or just didn't want this, foreign lord connected to the continent foisted upon them. Otto might have popped over briefly, but he never actually took control, never got the revenues.
That's telling. Even as King of Germany later, he was still trying to claim the money from York.
Yeah, years later. It shows how much he relied on, or at least felt entitled to, that English financial connection. It was part of his identity, it seems.
So York didn't work out. Richard's next move was even more ambitious, involving Scotland.
Oh, this was grand strategy. Around 1195, Richard starts negotiating for Otto to marry Margaret, the daughter of William the Lion, King of Scotland. She was the heir presumptive at the time.
And the deal involved redrawing the map almost.
Pretty much. It was incredibly complex. Lothian, a contested area, was supposed to go to Richard as part of the dowry. Then Otto would get Northumberland and Cumberland from England, but then hand those over to the King of Scotland.
Wow. That would have been a massive shift in the Anglo-Scottish balance, with Otto right in the middle.
Exactly. It shows how hard Richard was pushing to establish Otto. But these talks dragged on, and then the whole thing became moot in August 1198.
What?
William the Lion had a son, a direct male heir. Suddenly, Margaret wasn't the key figure anymore, and the whole complicated marriage and land swap just evaporated.
So Richard needed a plan C, something he could control more directly.
Right, and he found it on the continent. In September 1196, Richard, acting as Duke of Aquitaine, gave Otto the county of Poitou. Now, this was a solid base right in France.
And put him right in the thick of the fighting between Richard and King Philip II of France.
Precisely. Otto was fighting alongside his uncle, getting valuable military experience and becoming even more deeply embedded in that Angevin French conflict.
So when Emperor Henry VI dies unexpectedly in 1197, creating this power vacuum in Germany, Otto is there. He's experienced, he speaks the languages, but his whole worldview, his funding, his loyalty, it's Angevin, it's English and French.
Exactly. He wasn't like the other German princes. He came with Richard's money, Richard's political baggage, and Richard's enemies. This really sets the stage for the chaos to come. That label, first foreign king of Germany, maybe it's not so far off the mark, you know?
Right, so Henry VI dies in 1197, and the Holy Roman Empire is immediately thrown into turmoil, the German throne dispute. It's basically the Welf's Otto's family versus the Hohenstaufen.
Yeah, the Hohenstaufen had held the imperial title for a while, and crucially, they also controlled the Kingdom of Sicily down in southern Italy. This union of Germany and Sicily absolutely terrified the papacy. So when Henry VI died, his brother, Philip of Swabia, stepped up. The southern German princes mostly backed him, electing him in March 1198. He represented the established power.
And Otto became the candidate for the opposition.
Pretty much. The Welfs were traditionally strong in the north, in Saxony. Otto's supporters, mainly in the northwest and along the Rhine, elected him on June 9th, 1198. And here's where the international connection kicks in again.
Richard the Lionheart.
Immediately, Richard poured money into Otto's campaign. And when Richard died in 1199, his brother King John kept the funds flowing. For England, this was a way to fight the Hohenstaufen, who often sided with France, England's main rival. It was proxy warfare, basically.
Otto knew he had to act fast to look legitimate, didn't he? The coronation was key.
Absolutely critical. He needed to beat Philip to the punch, so he made a dash for Aachen Charlemagne's old capital, the traditional coronation site, and he got there first. He was crowned by the Archbishop of Cologne on July 12, 1198. Huge symbolic win.
But there was a catch, right? Something about the crown jewels.
A major catch. He was crowned with fake imperial regalia.
Fake? You're kidding?
Nope. The real crown, the scepter, the orb, all the symbols of imperial power were held by the Hohenstaufen side. Philip had them. So Otto had the right place, Aachen, and the right person, the Archbishop of Cologne, doing the crowning, but not the right bling.
That must have undermined his claim immediately.
Oh, definitely. It gave Philip's side endless ammunition. How legitimate can you be if you're crowned with knockoffs? It underscored how shaky his position really was.
Meanwhile, in Rome, Pope Innocent III is watching all this unfold. What's his play?
Innocent III was a master strategist. His absolute nightmare was that Hohenstaufen union of the Empire and Sicily. It would box the papacy in. So he needed an emperor who wouldn't pose that threat, someone weaker, maybe someone more pliable.
Under Otto IV.
Exactly. Otto was desperate for legitimacy, especially with the fake regalia issue, and he was reliant on that English money, which wasn't infinite. So he was willing to promise Innocent pretty much anything in return for papal recognition.
And Innocent used the Civil War chaos to his advantage in Italy?
He absolutely did. While the Germans were fighting amongst themselves, Innocent moved to strengthen papal control in central Italy. He kicked imperial lords out of key territories like the March of Ancona, the Duchy of Spoleto, Perugia, places controlling the roads to Rome.
He wasn't just reclaiming land, was he?
No, he was actively building alliances. He encouraged cities in Tuscany to form the League of San Genesio, basically putting them under papal protection and kicking the empire out of Tuscany too. So, when Innocent finally formally recognized Otto as the legitimate king in 1201, it was because Otto had agreed to all this. He'd signed away imperial interests in Italy.
Initially, it seemed like Otto was gaining ground with papal and English backing, but then things started to go wrong for him around 1204.
Yeah, the tide turned pretty dramatically. Philip of Swabia just started winning more battles. Crucially, in 1204, Philip managed to get himself crowned again, this time by the Archbishop of Cologne, the same guy who crowned Otto. That really hurt Otto's claim.
And the English money started drying up too.
Exactly. King John was losing badly to Philip II of France on the continent. Battles like Rochemont meant less cash could be spared for Otto. Allies started peeling away, seeing Philip winning. Even Otto's own brother, Henry, switched sides.
Ouch.
Yeah.
And then there was a major military defeat.
A big one. Near Wassenberg, July 27, 1206. Otto was wounded, his army beaten. He had to basically abandon everything and retreat to his family lands around Brunswick. By 1207, Philip of Swabia was winning everywhere. Even Pope Innocent was starting to think about maybe switching sides, as long as Philip promised to keep the empire and Sicily separate.
So Otto had effectively lost the war. It was over.
It looked that way, totally. Innocent was even trying to broker a deal. Otto gives up the crown, marries Philip's daughter Beatrix, gets the Duchy of Swabia as a consolation prize. Otto actually refused this deal, interestingly.
But then fate intervenes in a pretty brutal way.
Completely out of the blue. Philip of Swabia is murdered, June 21st, 1208. Not for political reasons, apparently, but in a private dispute with a count, Otto of Wittelsbach. Just like that, Otto V's main rival is gone. His fortunes changed overnight. It was like winning the medieval lottery.
Okay, so Philip is dead. Suddenly, Otto's back in the game, big time. What's his first move?
He moves fast to capitalize. He reconciles with the Stauffen party, Philip's former supporters. The key step here was getting engaged to Philip's daughter, Beatrix. That marriage was meant to heal the rift caused by a decade of civil war.
And did it work? Did the German princes accept him?
Amazingly, yes. At an election in Frankfurt, November 11th, 1208, he got support from basically everyone. All the electoral princes, Welf and Stauffen alike. It was universal backing.
But there was a condition, wasn't there? Something about inheritance.
Ah, yes. The princes remembered how the previous emperor, Henry VI, had tried to make the imperial crown hereditary within the Hohenstaufen family. They didn't want that again. So Otto had to swear an oath that he wouldn't try to make the crown hereditary for his own kids if he had any.
So the German side is settled. Now he needs the Pope for the big prize, the imperial coronation in Rome.
Mm-hmm.
And Innocent III is ready to make him pay.
Oh, absolutely. Innocent held all the cards now. Otto needed that crown desperately. And Innocent presented him with a bill, essentially. A list of massive concessions Otto had to agree to.
What kind of concessions are we talking about?
Huge territorial giveaways in Italy. Otto had to promise, in writing, to hand over basically all the lands the papacy claimed in central Italy, the March of Ancona, Duchy of Spoleto, Ravenna, the Pentapolis. These were strategically vital areas the emperors had controlled or tried to control for centuries.
So trading land for the title. What else? Did it affect his power within Germany too?
Significantly, he promised to let the church run its own bishop elections in Germany without imperial meddling. That was a big deal. He also agreed not to block appeals from German courts going to Rome, a major surrender of imperial legal authority, and maybe the most painful financially. He agreed that all the money from vacant bishoprics, which the emperor usually collected, would go straight to the church instead.
Wow. He basically gutted imperial power over the church in Germany.
On paper, yes, he agreed to it all. It was the price of the crown.
So promises made, he heads south, gets the Italian crown in Milan in 1208, and then the coronation in Rome.
October 4th, 1209, St. Peter's Basilica. Pope Innocent III himself places the imperial crown on Otto's head. This should have been the absolute peak of his life, the culmination of everything.
There's always a but with Otto, it seems.
Yeah. The celebrations didn't last long. Riots broke out in Rome almost immediately between Otto's German soldiers and the locals. It got so bad he had to leave the city right after being crowned. Not exactly a great start to his imperial reign.
And then comes the moment that defines his reign, really, the great betrayal. As soon as he's out of Rome, he tears up all his promises he just made to Innocent.
Almost instantly. By the time he reached Pisa in November 1209, the policy shift was dramatic and total. He just completely reversed course.
Why, after going through so much to get the crown, why throw it all away by immediately alienating the Pope who gave it to him? Did he think he was untouchable now?
It's hard to know for sure. Maybe a bit of imperial arrogance. The idea that once crowned, the emperor answers only to God. His advisors, people like Peter of Solano, probably told him those promises made under duress weren't binding. Plus, realistically, he needed lands and money to reward his followers, and those Italian territories he'd promised away were rich.
So what were the first steps in this new aggressive policy?
First, he marched back into those territories he'd just promised to the Pope Ancona and Spoleto and kicked out the papal troops. Just took them back.
Okay, that's a direct challenge.
But then he went further. He turned his attention south, towards the Kingdom of Sicily, ruled by the young Frederick, who was Innocent's ward. Otto demanded Frederick pay homage to him for southern Italy.
Which was the one thing Innocent absolutely wanted to prevent the emperor controlling Sicily.
Exactly. When Frederick, presumably on Innocent's advice, refused to show up, Otto declared Frederick's lands forfeited and started preparing an invasion of southern Italy. He was literally marching towards the Pope's worst nightmare.
And he didn't stop there, did he? He went after the church's legal rights, too.
This was the final straw, really. He demanded Innocent III annul the Concordat of Worms.
Remind us, the Concordat of Worms, 1122? That settled the big fight over who appoints bishops, right?
Right. It established a compromise. The church chose bishops. The emperor granted them their lands and temporal rights. Otto demanding its annulment meant he wanted to go back to the days when the emperor basically appointed the bishops directly. It was a full-scale assault on a century of church gains and papal authority, a complete declaration of war against Innocent III.
So Otto basically throws down the gauntlet to Innocent III. How does the Pope respond? I imagine he wasn't pleased.
Not pleased is putting it mildly. Innocent was known for being deliberate, but when pushed, he was incredibly decisive. The response was swift and brutal. November 18th, 1210, barely a year after the coronation.
Excommunication.
Full excommunication, the nuclear option in medieval politics. It didn't just cut Otto off spiritually, it declared all oaths of loyalty sworn to him null and void. It gave every prince in Germany a legitimate reason, a papal blessing even, to rebel against him.
And Otto's problems weren't just with the Pope in Italy, were they? He was neglecting things back in Germany.
Critically so. While Otto was busy trying to conquer southern Italy, playing emperor down south, he completely ignored his primary job as emperor from the German prince's perspective, defending the empire's northern borders.
This feels like his Angevin background coming back to bite him. His focus was elsewhere.
It really seems that way. He was focused on the Italian campaign, maybe on settling scores related to his old Angevin rivalries, but the German princes, they cared about the threat from Denmark.
And King Valdemar II of Denmark saw his chance.
Absolutely. With the emperor distracted, excommunicated, and campaigning hundreds of miles away, Valdemar went on the offensive. He basically conquered the entire German Baltic coast, from Holstein all the way to Livonia. Major ports, trade routes, all lost.
That must have infuriated the German nobility.
Far more than Otto's squabbles with the Pope over Sicily, probably. Losing territory, losing income, seeing the emperor fail in his basic duty of defense that eroded Otto's support at home much faster and more thoroughly than the excommunication itself. This northern disaster was really the trigger for what happened next.
Which was?
A rival king. Otto's enemies saw their chance, and the main instigator was King Philip II of France.
Otto's old Angevin enemy.
Exactly. Philip II hated the Angevins, and Otto was King John of England's nephew and ally. Philip wanted him gone. So Philip starts working with the Pope, who is, of course, delighted to find a way to get rid of Otto.
So the Pope and the King of France team up.
They do. With papal consent and French encouragement, a group of powerful German princes, including the archbishops of Mainz and Magdeburg, met at the Diet of Nuremberg in 1211. And who did they elect as the new king of the Romans, the anti-king to Otto?
Let me guess. Frederick of Sicily.
The very same. The young Frederick, son of the old Emperor Henry VI. The man Innocent III had spent years trying to keep off the imperial throne, was now his chosen candidate to depose Otto.
Talk about irony. Politics makes strange bedfellows.
It shows just how badly Otto had misplayed his hand. Innocent decided Frederick, even though a Hohenstaufen was the lesser of two evils compared to the defiant Otto. Frederick was young, still technically Innocent's ward. Otto was actively invading papal territory.
Did Otto try to salvage the situation? Maybe appeal to the Pope one last time?
He tried. He sent ambassadors to the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, a massive church council in Rome. They pleaded his case, apparently claimed he was repentant, offered to submit, begged for the excommunication to be lifted.
But Innocent wasn't buying it.
Not a chance. By then, Innocent had already publicly recognized Frederick as the emperor-elect. He saw Otto as unreliable, untrustworthy. The door was slammed shut.
So Otto returns to Germany in 1212 and finds himself facing another civil war, but this time the odds are stacked against him.
Completely. He's excommunicated, the Pope backs his rival, France backs his rival, and then he suffers another major blow.
What now?
His fiancée, Beatrix Philip of Swabia's daughter, the key to that reconciliation with the Stauffen party, she dies in the summer of 1212.
Oh no, so that alliance just collapses.
Instantly. Any remaining loyalty from the Stauffen side evaporated. When Frederick arrived in Germany with his army in September 1212, Otto's supporters just melted away. He was forced to retreat north, back to his wealth power base around Cologne. Frederick was then formally elected king again in December 1212, just to make it official. Otto was basically finished in Germany.
Okay, so Otto's cornered in Germany, excommunicated, deposed, most of his support gone. Does he have anyone left backing him?
Just one major player, his uncle, King John of England, and John had his own huge problems with Philip II of France. So this leads to one last desperate gamble, the Anglo-German
The
alliance.
final attempt to turn the tables.
Exactly. The plan was basically to crush Philip II of France. If they could defeat Philip, it would cut off the main foreign support for Frederick II, Otto's rival. For John, it was a chance to regain lost lands in France. For Otto, it was a chance to destroy Frederick's backer and maybe regain some prestige. A win-win if it worked.
And the plan involved a coordinated attack.
Yes, a pincer movement, set for February 1214. John would attack France from the southwest, near the Loire, hopefully drawing Philip II south. Then Otto, leading a big coalition army, Germans, Flemish, English troops would strike from the northeast near Flanders.
Sounds good on paper. How did it go in reality?
Terribly. Coordination completely broke down. John attacked, yes, but he was defeated fairly quickly at Rashomon and had to pull back even before Otto's northern army was fully ready to move.
So Philip II didn't have to split his forces.
Nope, he dealt with John, then turned his full attention north to face Otto and his allies. This sets up the decisive clash. The Battle of Bouvines, July 27, 1214.
Bouvines, that's a name that looms large in French history, isn't it?
Huge. It's often seen as a foundational moment for the French monarchy and national identity. And for Otto, it was the absolute end of the road.
What were the odds like? Did Otto have a chance?
Actually, Otto's coalition army seems to have outnumbered the French, maybe 25,000 allies against Philip's 15,000 or so. The numbers were on Otto's side.
So what went wrong? How did they lose if they had more men?
It was apparently a very close, very brutal battle fought near a bridge. But the whole thing turned, according to the chronicles, on a single, almost bizarre incident involving Otto himself.
What happened?
In the middle of the fighting, Otto was right in the thick of it, but his horse got wounded. It panic bolted and carried Otto off the battlefield against his will.
His horse ran away with him in the middle of
Yeah, that's the story. And the psychological effect on his army was devastating. They see the emperor suddenly disappearing from the fight. They probably assumed he was fleeing in panic.
And the army just collapsed.
Completely. Seeing the emperor gone, the allied forces broke and ran. It turned into a total rout. Philip II won a massive, decisive victory.
And there's that story about the imperial eagle afterwards.
Yes, a very symbolic anecdote. The Imperial Eagle Standard, Otto's main banner, was captured on the battlefield. Philip II supposedly had it sent directly to Frederick II, Otto's rival. The message was crystal clear. France has defeated your enemy. The empire is yours.
So Bouvines was the nail in the coffin for Otto.
Absolutely. The defeat shattered his remaining prestige and military power. He was forced back to his personal lands around Brunswick. The church formally deposed him again in 1215. He lived out his last few years pretty much in obscurity.
When did he die? And how? There's some confusion there, isn't there?
He died on May 19th, 1218 at Artsburg Castle. As for how? Well, there are two quite different versions of his final moments, which is interesting in itself.
What's the standard account?
The more conventional story is that he died of some illness but was deeply penitent at the end. He confessed his sins, especially his actions against the church, and asked for extreme penance to be mortally expiated, essentially cleansed before death. A fairly standard pious end for a medieval ruler.
And the other version. The more dramatic one.
Yeah. The historian Ernst Kantorowicz popularized a much grimmer picture. He describes Otto being thrown on the ground by an abbot, confessing his sins while priests literally beat him with rods, possibly even to death.
Seriously. Beaten to death by priests as penance.
It sounds shocking, right? Whether it was a literal flagellation that killed him, an extreme form of self-imposed penance he demanded, or maybe just a very graphic description of a harsh final ritual. It's hard to say for sure, but it's a striking image that certainly reflects the violence and the intense religious feeling of the age. Either way, penitent or beaten, he died.
And he's buried back in Brunswick.
Yes, alongside his parents, Henry the Lion and Matilda in Brunswick Cathedral, far from the imperial centers he once tried to rule.
Looking back at Otto's life, one thing really stands out in his personal affairs. He never had any children, did he?
No, he didn't, and that had pretty significant political consequences, or maybe confirmations. He was related to practically every major royal house, but his own line ended with him.
He was married twice, wasn't he? First to Beatrix.
Yes, briefly. He married Beatrix of Swabia, Philip's daughter, probably around 1212 as part of that reconciliation deal. But she died very soon after, in the summer of 1212. And as we said, her death broke that crucial link to the Stauffen party right when Frederick II was arriving in Germany.
And his second marriage.
After Bouvines, in 1214, he married Maria of Brabant. But again, no children came from that marriage either.
So that promise he made back in 1208, not to make the crown hereditary.
Ironically, it came true. He couldn't have made it hereditary even if he'd wanted to. He remains the first and only Holy Roman Emperor from the Welf dynasty. It began and ended with him.
So when we sum it all up, what's the lasting historical impact of Otto IV? Was he just a blip, a failed experiment?
Well, he wasn't just a blip. His reign, short and chaotic as it was, marks a really important moment. Firstly, yes, the Welf failure at the imperial level. Secondly, and maybe more importantly, his conflict with Innocent III was a major turning point in the empire-papacy power struggle.
How so?
His complete defiance, breaking promises, invading Sicily, challenging the Concordat of Worms, it forced Innocent III to react with full force. Otto's excommunication and deposition dramatically demonstrated papal power. It really cemented the Pope's position, for a time at least, as the ultimate political authority in Europe, capable of making and breaking emperors. His successor, Frederick II, even though a Hohenstaufen, would rule under much tighter papal constraints, partly because of Otto's failure.
So Otto's disastrous reign inadvertently strengthened the papacy he fought against.
In many ways, yes. He served as a cautionary tale. He proved that in the early 13th century, you simply couldn't defy Pope Innocent III and expect to keep the imperial crown. It was a very costly lesson for the empire. #shagoutro. So what's the takeaway here? What can Otto V's story tell us about medieval power?
Well, I think it's a fascinating case study. It shows how international connections like Otto's Angevin upbringing and Richard the Lionheart's backing, combined with political necessity, like Pope Innocent needing anyone but a Hohenstaufen controlling Sicily, could lift someone quite unexpectedly to the absolute pinnacle of power. Right. He got there because of circumstances almost entirely outside Germany itself. But the flip side is just as clear, isn't it? Power built on shifting alliances and external support is incredibly fragile.
Exactly. The moment Otto stopped being useful to the Pope, the moment he alienated his German base by failing to protect them specifically against the Danes in the north, and the moment he suffered that crushing military defeat at Louvain, it was all over. The foreign connections that raised him up couldn't save him when his domestic support collapsed and his luck ran out.
He was, in a way, caught between worlds. An English prince trying to be a German emperor, funded by English money, fighting French wars, while neglecting German problems.
And that leads us to a final thought, something for you to mull over. Considering how much Otto's English background and his deep involvement in Angevin conflicts shaped his priorities, did this fundamentally blind him? Did focusing so much on his uncle's wars in France and then on the Italian ambitions that perhaps came naturally from his Angevin perspective cause him to fatally underestimate the importance of defending the empire's own borders in the north?
Did his foreignness, in effect, lead directly to the collapse of his German support structure, paving the way for Bouvines and his ultimate downfall?
It's worth thinking about. How much did his international upbringing contribute to his inability to hold on to the most powerful position in Germany? Something for you to explore further.
Until next time, keep digging deeper.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, a behemoth of European history, the 30 Years' War. It raged from 1618 to 1648 and just fundamentally reshaped Central Europe.
It really did. It's a conflict that's often notoriously difficult to get your head around because it's so complex, so many phases, so many players.
Yeah.
But the impact, immense, arguably the most destructive event in that region until the 20th century.
And the human cost is just, it's almost unbelievable when you hear the figures.
They're horrifying. Estimates range,
Yeah.
but we're generally looking at something between 4.5 and maybe even 8 million deaths.
Yeah.
Soldiers, civilians, lost to battle, sure, but mostly famine and disease.
8 million in the 17th century. It's staggering. And that translates directly to the landscape, right? I mean, you read about parts of Germany seeing population drops of over 50%.
Over 50% in some areas, absolutely.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a war between states, it was a war that hollowed out society itself, a demographic catastrophe.
So, our mission today for this deep dive is to take the sources we have, and they're pretty comprehensive, covering origins, the different phases, the human cost, military shifts, the whole lot, and try to build a clear picture.
Exactly. We want to unpack it all, move beyond just the initial religious disagreements, which were definitely the spark, but we need to get at the deeper drivers, imperial rivalries, dynastic ambitions, and honestly, the sheer logistical nightmare of keeping armies in the field for 30 years, that's what really fueled the fire.
Right. We'll see how it shattered the old Holy Roman Empire, how it arguably led to our modern idea of sovereign states, and, crucially, how it paved the way for France to become Europe's dominant power. Okay, let's dive in. Where do we start? The foundations, I guess. the cracks already present in the Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah, the origins go back decades before 1618. You really have to start with the Reformation in the 16th century and the attempt to settle the religious fighting with the Peace of Augsburg in 1555.
Ah, yes, Augsburg, the famous Quis Regio, Eius Religio, whose realm, his religion. The idea was the local ruler decides if the state is Lutheran or Catholic. Seems practical on the surface.
It sounds practical, but it was riddled with problems. Our sources point to, well, three really big flaws. First, and maybe most importantly, it just didn't reflect the religious reality on the ground anymore.
How so?
It only recognized Lutheranism and Catholicism. It completely ignored Calvinism, which was growing rapidly, especially in important states like the Palatinate. And Calvinism wasn't just another flavor of Protestantism. It was seen as radical, hostile by both Catholics and many Lutherans.
So you've got this major dynamic religious movement spreading across the empire, but it has no legal standing under the peace treaty. That sounds unstable.
Deeply unstable. Legal and theological time bomb, really. Then second, you have the issue of property. Church property.
Always about land and money, isn't it?
Often, yes. Augsburg said Lutherans could keep church lands seized since 1552. But anything taken before that, supposedly returned. It was a constant source of friction. And then you have Archduke Ferdinand, soon to be Emperor Ferdinand II, was deeply Catholic, very conservative.
And he wanted to roll back those gains.
He wanted to reverse all Protestant property gains going back to 1555. This wasn't just piety. Reclaiming that property meant huge financial and political power for the Catholic side and for him.
Okay, so Augsburg was less a peace treaty, more like a shaky ceasefire built on ignoring a major religion and kicking the can down the road on property disputes. And the political structure itself wasn't exactly robust, was it? The Holy Roman Empire.
It was incredibly fragmented. You had something like 300 different imperial estates. Some were huge territories run by powerful prince electors, the 7 guys who actually chose the emperor. Others were tiny little free cities or lordships.
So very decentralized, not much central authority.
Almost none in practice. The imperial diet, the sort of parliament, met rarely. And when it did, it was more about negotiation, discussion. It couldn't really legislate or enforce anything strongly. It was a system just begging to be exploited by ambitious princes or indeed foreign powers.
And the dominant power within this fragmented system was the House of Habsburg. But it's important to remember they weren't monolithic, right? There were 2 main branches.
Crucially, yes. You had the Austrian Habsburgs. They were the land power in Central Europe, Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, ruling maybe 8 million people, focused on HRE politics, the Ottomans on their border.
And then the Spanish Habsburgs, the global superpower, empire spanning the Americas, the Philippines, parts of Italy, the Netherlands, a maritime giant.
Exactly. And here's a key point our sources really emphasize. Despite being family, lots of intermarriage, shared dynasty, there wasn't really a single Habsburg policy.
Their interests could diverge quite a bit.
Significantly, Spain was pouring money, huge subsidies, into Austria, especially as tensions rose. That was vital. But if Spain got into financial trouble, say, fighting the Dutch, or problems in the colonies, the Austrian branch felt it immediately. That link and that potential vulnerability is vital to understanding the whole conflict.
Okay, so the stage is set. Religious tensions simmering, unresolved property issues, a fragmented political system, and these powerful but sometimes competing Habsburg branches alongside ambitious German princes. What pushed it over the edge? The years leading up to 1618 must have been tense.
Extremely tense. You see these local conflicts constantly flaring up, proving Augsburg wasn't working. Like the Cologne War in the 1580s started just because the archbishop converted to Calvinism. Or in Danworth in 1606, a dispute over religious processions led to a Catholic takeover, forcibly changing the town's religion. These weren't just isolated punch-ups, they showed the system was failing.
And Archduke Ferdinand's actions didn't exactly help calm things down. Quite the opposite. In 1608, he made this sweeping demand: immediate restoration of all Catholic Church property taken since 1555. No more case-by-case talks, just give it all back, now.
Wow. That must have sent shockwaves through every Protestant state.
It did. It threatened their finances, their territory. It completely paralyzed the imperial diet because compromise was suddenly off the table. And maybe most importantly, it shattered any illusion that the emperor or the future emperor was neutral. He picked a side. Very clearly.
The central authority basically declared its intention to fundamentally change the status quo by force.
That's a good way to put it. And the reaction was predictable. The Protestant states, led by the Calvinist Elector Palatine Frederick IV, formed the Protestant Union in 1608. an armed defensive alliance.
And the Catholics responded in kind.
Led by the shrewd Maximilian of Bavaria, they formed the Catholic League in July 1609. So by 1609, you have these two armed camps staring each other down. The empire was polarized, militarized. All it needed was one incident to set the whole thing ablaze.
And that incident famously happens in Bohemia, Prague, 1618.
Yes, the Bohemian Revolt. Ferdinand, who had been elected King of Bohemia in 1617, was deeply unpopular there. Bohemia had a strong Protestant tradition, and they knew Ferdinand's record of, shall we say, vigorously promoting Catholicism in his own lands.
Even though he initially promised to respect their religious freedoms?
He did, but nobody really trusted him. The Bohemian nobility saw the writing on the wall erosion of their rights, forced Catholicism. Their frustration boiled over in May 1618 with the legendary defenestration of Prague.
Throwing the emperor's representatives out of a window, it sounds almost comical, except for the implications.
3 officials tossed out of the castle window. They survived, supposedly landing at a pile of dung, but the message was crystal clear. This was rebellion. Open defiance of imperial authority.
Yeah, and the Bohemians didn't stop there. They formally deposed Ferdinand as their king, and then they made a fateful choice.
They offered the crown to Frederick V, the Elector Palatine, the leader of the Protestant Union, a Calvinist.
And Frederick accepted, becoming the Winter King because his reign was so short. Why was this specific choice so explosive?
Because it wasn't just about Bohemia anymore. Frederick accepting the crown threatened the whole imperial power structure. The emperor was chosen by 7 electors. If Ferdinand lost the Bohemian electoral vote to a Calvinist, well, that could tip the balance away from Habsburg control.
So Ferdinand had to react strongly.
Immediately, he rallied support from the Catholic League, especially Maximilian of Bavaria, and got crucial backing from Spain. Their combined forces met the Bohemians and Frederick at the Battle of White Mountain, just outside Prague, in November 1620.
And it was decisive.
Utterly. A crushing defeat for Frederick. He fled. The revolt was stamped out in Bohemia, but the war wasn't over. It just shifted focus.
To Frederick's own territory, the Palatinate. And this is where the wider geopolitics really kick in, especially Spain's interests.
Exactly. Now we see the shift from a seemingly religious dispute to hard-nosed realpolitik. Spain was fighting its long war against the Dutch Republic, the 80 Years' War, and for that, they needed soldiers and supplies to get from their territories in Italy up to Flanders.
Overland, because the English and Dutch navies controlled the sea route.
Precisely. They needed the Spanish road, this vital land corridor. And where did it run? Straight through the Palatinate, Frederick's lands.
A Calvinist territory led by the emperor's enemy, sitting right on Spain's crucial military highway. Okay, I see the problem.
So Spain had a direct strategic interest in crushing Frederick and securing that route. Meanwhile, Ferdinand owed Maximilian of Bavaria a big reward for his help.
What did Maximilian get?
He got Frederick's electoral title and control over the Upper Palatinate. This was formalized in the Treaty of Munich. Basically, Ferdinand took the lands and status of a legally elected Prince Frederick and just gave them away to his Catholic ally.
That must have alienated a lot of other princes, even Protestant ones who hadn't supported Frederick's Bohemian adventure.
Tremendously. They saw it as imperial overreach. The emperor deposing a prince-elector and redistributing his lands. That felt like a threat to all of their own autonomy, regardless of religion. So by late 1622, Spanish and Catholic League forces had occupied most of the Palatinate. The war was now fully international, pulling in Spain and the Dutch directly.
And it didn't stop there.
Yeah.
The conflict continued to draw in more foreign powers, Denmark first.
Christian IV of Denmark jumped in around 1625. He was also Duke of Holstein, so technically part of the empire. His motives were mixed. Genuine concern for Protestants, yes, but also
money and power.
Definitely. Control of the Baltic Sea trade was hugely lucrative. And controlling the mouths of the Elbe and Weser rivers meant collecting tolls. Christian saw a chance to boost Danish power and finances.
The Habsburgs must have been stretched thin at this point, fighting the Dutch, dealing with the fallout in Germany, now Denmark.
They were. And Ferdinand needed a new solution. He found one in Albrecht von Wallenstein.
Wallenstein, a controversial figure, to say the least.
Brilliant military organizer, but ruthless. Ferdinand hired him essentially as a military contractor. Wallenstein raised a huge army, tens of thousands strong, almost from scratch. And the way he funded it was innovative and brutal.
How did he pay for it all?
He made the war pay for itself. His army levied enormous contributions, basically ransoms and plunder from every territory it passed through. Didn't matter if it was allied, enemy, or neutral. Everyone paid.
So less a state army, more like a giant mobile protection racket that devastated everything in its path.
That's a pretty accurate description. Militarily, it worked. It didn't drain the imperial treasury. Politically, it was toxic. It caused immense resentment. Still, Wallenstein's army crushed the Danes, defeated Christian IV at Lutter in 1626, occupied Jutland. Denmark was forced out by the Peace of Lübeck in 1629. Its Baltic power ambitions basically finished.
But Ferdinand, buoyed by the success, then made a huge mistake.
Arguably the biggest political blunder of the entire war, the Edict of Restitution in March 1629.
We mentioned it briefly. He ordered all Catholic church lands taken since 1555 to be returned immediately.
Yes. Riding high on victory, feeling invincible perhaps, he demanded a complete reversal of decades of Protestant gains. Imagine, if you're listening, suddenly being told the legal basis for your state's boundaries, its finances, its very identity is invalid. That's what it felt like for nearly every Protestant state in North and Central Germany.
And it explicitly denied Calvinism any rights, too.
Completely. It was a maximalist Catholic position. And crucially, it united almost all the German princes, Lutheran, Calvinist, even some Catholics worried about imperial power against Ferdinand. It showed he wasn't interested in compromise, only in imposing his will. It guaranteed the war would escalate further.
And that paved the way for the next major intervention, Sweden.
Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden.
Yeah.
The Line of the North. He lands in Pomerania in 1630. Again, mixed motives. He was a devout Lutheran, genuinely wanted to support the Protestant cause, but also...
New Baltic trade. Swedish power.
Absolutely. Sweden wanted dominance in the Baltic. Controlling the German coastline was key to controlling that trade. So, religion and power politics, hand in hand.
And Sweden wasn't acting alone financially, were they? France was involved behind the scenes.
Critically involved. France, under Cardinal Richelieu, saw the Habsburgs, both Spanish and Austrian, as their main rival. They weren't ready to fight directly yet, but they were happy to fund Sweden to do the fighting for them. The Treaty of Bärwalde in 1631 was huge.
How much money are we talking?
France promised Sweden 400,000 Reichsthaler a year. That basically boosted Sweden's entire state income by over 25%. It allowed Gustavus to maintain a large, very well-trained and equipped army of about 36,000 men. French money was the lubricant that kept the Swedish war machine going.
Even with Swedish troops on German soil, many German Protestant princes were hesitant to join them, weren't they? Until Magdeburg.
The sack of Magdeburg in May 1631. It was a watershed moment.
Right.
Just horrific. Imperial and Catholic League forces under Tilly besieged the city, a major Protestant center. When it fell, there was a massacre. Maybe 20,000, 25,000 civilians killed. The city was essentially destroyed by fire.
And the imperial side didn't exactly hide this, did they?
No, it was almost used as propaganda, a terrifying warning. And it worked, but not in the way they hoped. It horrified Protestant Germany. Princes like those in Saxony and Brandenburg realized neutrality wasn't an option anymore. They finally, formally allied with Sweden.
And the Swedish army, with its new tactics, proved devastatingly effective.
Yes, Gustavus Adolphus had revolutionized infantry tactics. More flexible formations, more firepower, better use of artillery. They won stunning victories at Breitenfeld in 1631, then Rain in 1632. It looked like Sweden might sweep the imperial forces aside.
But then tragedy struck the Swedish cause.
At the Battle of Lutzen in November 1632, it was technically a Swedish victory, but a bloody, costly one, and Gustavus Adolphus himself was killed in the fighting.
A massive blow. How did Sweden cope?
His chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna, took over the political direction and kept the war effort going. But losing Gustavus, their charismatic leader and military genius, was huge. Swedish dominance started to wane.
And this period also sees the downfall of Wallenstein.
Yes, Wallenstein had been recalled by Ferdinand after the early Swedish successes, but he'd become too powerful, too independent. Ferdinand grew deeply suspicious. Was Wallenstein negotiating his own peace? Was he planning to betray the emperor?
So Ferdinand decided to remove him.
He ordered his arrest in early 1634, declared him a traitor. Wallenstein fled, but was assassinated by some of his own officers, likely acting on imperial orders in the town of Eger in February 1634.
With Wallenstein gone, Ferdinand had to rely more heavily on Spanish military support, didn't he?
Completely. Spanish troops and commanders became central to the imperial war effort, and this reliance paid off initially. A combined imperial Spanish army won a huge, decisive victory over the Swedes at Nördlingen in September 1634.
What was the impact of Nördlingen?
It shattered Swedish military power in southern Germany. It effectively ended that phase of overwhelming Swedish dominance and forced them and their remaining German allies to start thinking about making peace with the emperor. It looked like maybe the war could finally end.
So Nördlingen, a major imperial victory. Sweden weakened. You'd think peace talks would be the next logical step. Why didn't the war end in 1634 or 1635?
One word: France. Cardinal Richelieu saw that imperial Spanish victory at Nördlingen and got seriously worried. A triumphant, unified Habsburg bloc dominating Central Europe. That was France's worst nightmare.
So France decided it couldn't just fund proxies anymore.
Exactly. Nördlingen forced Richelieu's hand. In May 1635, France declared war directly on Spain, formally entering the 30 Years' War. This kicks off the Franco-Spanish War, which actually lasts even longer, until 1659.
But wait, didn't the German states and the emperor actually make peace around the same time, the Peace of Prague?
They did, also in May 1635. It was a major attempt to heal the internal divisions within the empire. Ferdinand III, the new emperor, basically agreed to scrap the hated Edict of Restitution. And the separate Protestant and Catholic leagues were supposed to be dissolved and merged into one imperial army.
So internally, within the Holy Roman Empire, a compromise was reached.
Largely, yes. That's why 1635 is such a crucial turning point. Most historians see this as the moment the conflict stopped being primarily a German religious war
And became
a European power struggle.
dominated by the rivalry between Bourbon France and the Habsburgs, both Spanish and Austrian. The German states, having mostly made peace among themselves, now just became the battleground for these larger powers. Their lands were where the French, Spanish, Swedish, and imperial armies would continue to fight for another 13 years.
And what was France's main goal now that they were directly involved?
Strategy number 1, cut the Spanish road. That Habsburg supply line from Italy to Flanders. It was the logistical artery keeping the Spanish war effort against the Dutch and now the French alive.
Did they succeed? Brilliantly. In 1638, a French-funded army led by Bernard of Saxe-Weimar captured the fortress of Breisach on the Rhine. That victory gave France control of Alsace and, crucially, physically severed the Spanish road. Permanently.
How did Spain react? They must have needed to resupply Flanders somehow.
They had to rely on the sea route, which was incredibly dangerous because of the powerful Dutch Navy. And that led to another disaster for Spain.
The Battle of the Downs.
October 1639. The Dutch fleet intercepted and absolutely smashed a huge Spanish armada trying to reach Flanders. It was a devastating naval defeat. It basically ended Spain's ability to effectively reinforce or supply its army in Flanders by sea. The strategic vice was tightening on Spain. Pressure to make peace was mounting in Madrid.
But the fighting in Germany itself just ground on.
Relentlessly. Sweden was still a major player, especially under their general Lennart Torstenson. He was known for incredibly fast campaigns. In 1642, he inflicted another huge defeat on the Imperial Army at the Second Battle of Breitenfeld, capturing Leipzig. The Imperials suffered massive casualties.
But the really symbolic blow to Spain came the following year, didn't it? Rocroi.
The Battle of Rocroi, May 1643, fought in northern France. This is often seen as the symbolic end of Spain's military dominance on land. The French army, under the young Duc d'Enghien, later known as the Great Condé, won a crushing victory over the Spanish army of Flanders.
Why was Rocroi so significant? It wasn't just another battle loss for Spain.
It shattered the aura of invincibility around the Spanish tercios, their famed infantry formations that had dominated European battlefields for over a century. It confirmed the Spanish road was gone for good. It basically forced Madrid to finally accept that the Dutch Republic was independent. Rocroi signaled the decline of Spain and the rise of France as the continent's leading military power.
While all this is happening, there's a strange side conflict involving Sweden and Denmark again. The Torstenson War.
Yeah, it almost seems like a distraction, but it had serious consequences. Torstenson invaded Danish Jutland in 1643. Why? Well, Christian IV of Denmark was trying to mediate the peace talks, which annoyed the Swedes. But more importantly, Denmark was trying to raise the tolls charged on ships passing through the Sound into the Baltic Sea.
Affecting Swedish and Dutch trade profits.
Exactly. So Sweden attacked Denmark to stop the mediation and the toll hikes. The Emperor, Ferdinand III, felt obligated to help Denmark. He sent his main imperial army under General Gallas north to relieve the Danes.
And how did that go?
It was an unmitigated disaster. Gallus's army basically disintegrated. Chasing Torstenson around, unable to supply itself, it just melted away through desertion, starvation, and disease. A huge waste of the emperor's dwindling resources, just as the French and Swedes were preparing for the final push.
So the Habsburgs were really on the ropes now.
Definitely. In 1646, combined French and Swedish forces pushed deep into Bavaria, forcing Maximilian, the emperor's key ally, to briefly sue for peace. The final nail in the coffin was the Franco-Swedish victory at Zusmarshausen in May 1648. That left Bavaria completely open. The imperial cause looked hopeless.
And the very last act of the war was looting.
Pretty much. Just before the peace treaty was finalized, a Swedish force under Königsmark made a dash for Prague in July 1648. They weren't trying to conquer it strategically, they were after plunder. They managed to seize Prague Castle in the Malá district, capturing treasures, including the famous Codex Gigas manuscript, before the treaty stopped them, a rather ignominious end.
It's crucial, though, as you mentioned earlier, to remember this wasn't just happening in Germany and Flanders. The global dimension was putting huge pressure on Spain, especially.
Absolutely vital to understanding Spain's collapse. Take northern Italy. Still key for that Spanish road connection, even if broken further north. There was the War of the Mantuan Succession from 1628 to 1631. Seems like a minor conflict over who inherits a duchy.
But it had bigger implications.
Huge ones, because Pope Urban VIII actually opposed the Habsburg candidate. He feared Habsburg dominance in Italy. This papal opposition effectively split the Catholic powers. It made it okay, politically, for Catholic France to ally with Protestant Sweden against the Catholic Austrian Habsburgs, a major diplomatic shift.
And Italy suffered directly in other ways, too?
Massively. The Italian plague of 1629-1631, likely spread by troop movements, was devastating. Milan lost maybe 60,000 people. It crippled the economy of northern Italy right when Spain needed it as a logistical base. And later you get revolts against Spanish rule, like in Naples in 1647. Spain was just stretched too thin.
And stretched thin back home, too, Catalonia.
The Reapers' War, starting in 1640, it was a massive revolt in Catalonia, triggered by Madrid trying to raise taxes to pay for the 30 Years' War. France immediately jumped in to support the rebels, even got them to declare Louis XIII of France as their ruler for a time.
Did the revolt succeed?
Ultimately, no. Spain eventually retook Barcelona in 1651. But for over a decade, it tied down enormous Spanish military resources and drained the treasury at the worst possible time. Troops and money that should have been fighting France and Germany or Flanders were stuck dealing with rebellion in Spain itself.
And then there's the truly global conflict, the fight between the Dutch and the Portuguese. How did that fit in?
Well, Portugal was ruled by the Spanish king from 1580 to 1640, the Iberian Union. So for the Dutch, fighting Portugal was part of fighting Spain. The Dutch West India Company aggressively attacked Portuguese colonies, especially aiming for the lucrative sugar trade and slave trade.
Where specifically?
They briefly captured Salvador and Brazil, established Dutch Brazil for a while in the northeast, and seized Portuguese slave trading posts in Angola and São Tomé in Africa. This wasn't just colonial squabbling, it directly hit the Spanish crown's income. Sugar and slaves meant money, and the Dutch were cutting off that tap.
So, the outcome of the war in Germany was being influenced by battles over slave forts in Africa and sugar plantations in Brazil. It really shows how interconnected things were becoming even then, a truly global conflict in many ways.
It highlights the financial underpinnings. Spain's global empire was both its strength and its Achilles heel. The cost of maintaining it and fighting wars everywhere simultaneously ultimately broke its power.
Let's really focus now on the sheer cost of this war. The deep scars it left. We mentioned the horrifying death toll, 4.5 to maybe 8 million, mostly civilians, mostly after 1630, right, when the big foreign armies really got involved.
That's generally the consensus, yes. The first decade was destructive, but the entry of Sweden, then France, and the constant back-and-forth campaigning across Germany for years on end, that's when the devastation reached truly epic proportions.
And the breakdown of how people died is revealing. It wasn't mostly battles.
Not even close for civilians. Our sources suggest maybe only 3% of civilian deaths were directly caused by fighting, being caught in crossfire, massacres like Magdeburg. The vast majority, disease and starvation.
What were the biggest killers?
Bubonic plague was the monster. It accounts for maybe 64% of civilian deaths in this period. Then starvation, around 12%. Then other diseases that thrive when sanitation breaks down and people are malnourished, typhus, dysentery, those had another chunk. It was the collapse of society that killed most people.
Armies marching through didn't just fight, they consumed everything. Food, supplies, and spread disease.
Exactly. They stripped regions bare, repeatedly. Even supposedly friendly armies had to eat. You combine constant plundering with poor harvests, which happened frequently during these years, and get widespread famine.
The descriptions are just harrowing. People eating grass, cannibalism.
There are contemporary accounts, yes. Diaries, chronicles. They speak of utter desperation. People too weak to bury the dead. Reports of cannibalism in the most devastated areas. It's hard to fathom the level of suffering. The complete breakdown of order meant survival by any means necessary. Central Europe became, in many places, a wasteland.
And the demographic impact lasted for generations. That
Mhm.
40% average population drop across the German states.
And nearly 50% in places like Pomerania, Mecklenburg, Württemberg. Think about that, half the people gone. And the recovery was so slow. Populations didn't get back to pre-war levels until around 1750. That's over 100 years later. It shows how deep the economic and social damage was.
Even for the soldiers themselves, the primary killer wasn't combat.
No, far from it. Estimates suggest for every soldier killed in battle, 2 or 3 died from disease. Camps were breeding grounds for sickness: typhus, camp fever, dysentery, plague.
There's that stark example from the sources, the Swedish village.
Yeah, it's chilling. One village conscripted 230 men over the course of the war. By the end, 215 of them were dead or missing, vanished into the war machine. Your life expectancy as a recruit was incredibly short, measured in months, really.
Beyond the sheer numbers, how did the war tear apart the social fabric?
Well, the collapse of local government was key. Lords fled, administration disappeared. This created huge numbers of landless, desperate peasants. Some turned to banditry, others joined the armies just to survive. It led to peasant revolts in some areas, like Upper Austria, born of sheer desperation.
And the environmental damage, you mentioned wolves.
Yeah, the sources talk about how armies trampling farmland, combined with population loss, literally changed the ecosystem. Large areas went wild again. That report from Bavaria in 1638-39, overrun by wolves because there were so few people, and then wild pigs destroying what little crops were left. It paints a picture of nature reclaiming a devastated land.
And in this climate of fear, chaos, and inexplicable suffering, people looked for scapegoats. The witch hunts.
It was a dark period for that, too. There was a frenzy of despair, as one source puts it. Intense witch hunts erupted, especially in Catholic prince-bishoprics like Würzburg, Bamberg, Eichstätt. Thousands were executed.
And interestingly, these weren't always the areas that saw the heaviest fighting.
That's a crucial point. Often, the worst witch crazes happened in places relatively untouched by the battles themselves. It suggests it wasn't a direct reaction to armies marching through, but maybe a symptom of the wider societal trauma. People couldn't understand why this endless catastrophe was happening, so they looked for supernatural causes, for someone to blame. And authorities in some areas tragically fueled that fire.
Yet, paradoxically, out of all this horror came a kind of rebirth in German literature.
It did, strangely enough. The shared trauma seems to have sparked a move towards realism, towards depicting the harsh realities of life. You get early novels like Grimmelshausen's Simplicissimus, a picaresque tale based on his own experiences as a soldier. It's brutal, satirical, and gives an unvarnished look at the war.
And diaries, too, like Peter Hagendorf's.
Exactly. Diaries like Hagendorf's, An Ordinary Mercenary Soldier, are invaluable. They give you the ground-level view, the endless marching, the casual violence, the struggle for food, the fear, the boredom. It's a world away from the grand strategy, but just as important for understanding the reality of the war.
Let's shift gears slightly to the military side. We hear about the military revolution during this period. What actually changed in how wars were fought?
Tactically, there were significant changes, building on earlier developments. The big shift, spearheaded by Maurice of Orange and the Dutch Republic, and then really perfected by Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, was moving away from those big, dense infantry squares. The Spanish tercio was the classic example.
Towards what?
Thinner, linear formations. Gustavus typically deployed his infantry 6 ranks deep, instead of 10 or more. The goal was to maximize firepower, more muskets firing simultaneously.
So, more guns, shallower lines.
Essentially, yes. A higher proportion of musketeers compared to pikemen. And crucially, Gustavus integrated light, mobile artillery pieces directly with his infantry units, often on the flanks. They could fire quickly and provide immediate support.
And we saw the impact at battles like Breitenfeld.
Breitenfeld in 1631 is the textbook example. The flexible Swedish line formations, with their superior firepower and artillery support, just chewed up the older, more cumbersome imperial formations under Tilly. It really showcased the effectiveness of these new tactics.
And cavalry changed too, partly because armies got smaller.
Yeah, the logistical nightmare of feeding huge armies meant that as the war dragged on, forces often became smaller, more mobile. This put a premium on effective cavalry, not just for scouting, but for shock action. Think of the Finnish Hakkapeliitta, with the Swedes' light, fast, aggressive cavalry used for decisive charges.
But if tactics were evolving, did strategy keep pace? Were campaigns fought for clear political objectives?
Often, no. That's one of the key arguments in the sources. Strategic thinking often lagged behind tactical innovation. Many campaigns seem almost pointless in hindsight, achieving no lasting political goal.
So if they weren't always fighting for strategic territory or political aims, what was the main objective of a campaign?
Increasingly, it became simply finding money and supplies. The need to feed and pay the army became the primary driver of operations. Armies marched not necessarily towards the enemy, but towards areas that hadn't been stripped bare yet, where they could extract contributions.
So logistics wasn't just supporting the strategy, logistics became the strategy.
In many ways, yes. Keeping the army in existence became an end in itself. This explains why armies inflicted so much devastation, even on theoretically Allied territory. They had to survive. Wallenstein's system was just the most extreme example of this principle.
So if we talk about a military revolution, maybe the biggest change wasn't the guns or the formations.
Arguably, the most revolutionary aspect wasn't the technology, but the organization. The sheer challenge of funding, supplying, and directing permanent standing armies for decades. That required a level of state organization that hadn't existed before.
Moving away from reliance on mercenary captains like Wallenstein.
Exactly. The war showed the dangers of relying on private military entrepreneurs. It pushed European states towards creating larger, permanent, state-controlled military bureaucracies. It was about transferring the monopoly on organized violence from individuals to the state. That, perhaps, was the true revolution, the birth of the modern military state.
Okay, so after 3 decades of this brutal, sprawling conflict, they finally managed to make peace. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648. The negotiations themselves must have been incredibly complex.
Monumental. It wasn't just one meeting. It was a huge diplomatic congress spread across 2 Westphalian cities. Münster and Osnabrück took years. Sources mention around 109 different delegations involved, representing all the major and minor players. You had mediators from the papacy, from Venice. It was really the first big multi-party peace negotiation of its kind in Europe.
And one of the first major outcomes, even before settling things within the empire, was sorting out the Dutch situation.
Yes. The Peace of Münster, which was part of the overall Westphalia settlement, formally recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic from Spain after 80 years of fighting. And crucially, it confirmed Amsterdam's dominance in trade by giving the Dutch control over the Scheldt estuary.
Which blocked access to Antwerp.
Exactly. It crippled Antwerp, Spain's main port in the region, for centuries. A huge economic victory for the Dutch, cementing their rise as a commercial power.
Now, turning to the Holy Roman Empire itself, what were the big constitutional changes? How did Westphalia reshape the empire's internal structure?
The absolute core change was about imperial power versus the power of the individual states, what the Germans called German liberties. Essentially, Emperor Ferdinand III had to formally accept that the imperial diet, the assembly of princes and cities, was supreme in matters of legislation, war, and peace.
So the Habsburg dream of turning the HRE into a centralized, absolutist state like France or Spain, that was dead.
Officially dead and buried. Westphalia confirmed the autonomy, the sovereignty, really, of the major states like Bavaria, Saxony, Brandenburg. The emperor's power was significantly curtailed. The empire would remain this loose, decentralized collection of states.
And the religious question. Augsburg had failed spectacularly. How did Westphalia create a lasting religious peace?
It was much more comprehensive and, frankly, more realistic than Augsburg. It kept the basic idea of cuius regio, eius religio, the ruler, sets the official religion, but with 2 crucial updates. First, it finally officially recognized Calvinism.
Putting it on equal legal footing with Catholicism and Lutheranism.
Yes, that was huge. It brought the 3rd major faith into the legal framework. Second, and maybe even more important for stability, it established a fixed date, the normal jure, or normal year, which was set as 1624.
What did that mean, the normal year?
It meant that whatever the official religion of a territory was on January 1st, 1624, that became its permanent legal status. And crucially, the peace took away the ruler's right, the aesis reformandi, to force his subjects to convert if he changed his religion later on.
Ah, so if a prince converted from Lutheranism to Catholicism after 1648, his Lutheran subjects didn't have to follow him.
Exactly. They were protected. Their churches, their property rights, based on the 1624 status quo, were guaranteed. This created much more stability and protected religious minorities within the different states. It took religion off the table as a legitimate cause for future wars within the empire.
Okay, let's talk territory. Who were the winners and losers in terms of land and influence? France did well.
France gained significantly. Richelieu's and later Mazarin's objectives were largely met. They got formal control of the bishoprics of Metz, Toul, and Verdun, plus territories and cities in Alsace. This pushed French influence right up to the Rhine River, a major strategic gain.
And Sweden, they'd done a lot of the fighting.
Sweden was handsomely rewarded. They got a huge cash indemnity, 5 million thalers. They received western Pomerania on the Baltic coast, plus the bishoprics of Bremen and Verden near the North Sea. Critically, control of these German territories gave the Swedish king seats in the imperial diet. So Sweden became a guarantor of the peace, with a permanent say in German affairs.
What about the rising German powers, Brandenburg, Prussia?
They did very well too. Brandenburg got eastern Pomerania, plus several secularized bishoprics. This significantly expanded its territory and laid the foundation for Prussia's future rise as a major German power.
And Frederick V's son, the Winter King's heir.
Charles Louis got the Lower Palatinate back, and a new 8th electoral title was created for him. But Bavaria kept the Upper Palatinate and, importantly, kept the original prestigious Palatine electoral vote. Maximilian of Bavaria came out strong.
So, looking at the bigger picture, what was the long-term geopolitical impact of all this? How did Westphalia change the map of power in Europe?
Well, the biggest shift was the clear separation of the Spanish and Austrian Habsburgs as distinct political entities with diverging interests. France achieved its goal of preventing Habsburg encirclement and broke Spanish military dominance. This really cleared the way for France, under Louis XIV, to become the predominant power on the continent for the next century or so.
But the Austrian Habsburgs, despite losing influence within the HRE, actually consolidated their own power base.
Paradoxically, yes. While they lost the fight for control over Germany, the war allowed them to brutally re-Catholicize their own hereditary lands, like Bohemia. They emerged with a more geographically coherent, religiously unified bloc of territories in Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary. Their focus shifted eastwards and southwards.
And the most famous legacy the one political science students still learn about is this idea of Westphalian sovereignty.
Yes. It's maybe debated exactly how sharply it emerged at Westphalia, but the treaty certainly codified key principles. The idea that states are sovereign within their borders and other states shouldn't interfere in their domestic affairs. Non-interference.
How did it change the relationship between rulers and the people?
By confirming the authority of the individual state rulers over religion and governance within the German liberties framework, it solidified the idea that subjects owed their primary loyalty to their state ruler, not to some distant emperor or pope. This made it easier for those rulers to build state power, raise taxes, levy national armies, contributing to that militarization and centralization within the individual German states we talked about.
So Westphalia effectively marks the end of the medieval ideal of a unified Christendom under emperor and pope.
The very strong marker for that, yes. Religion didn't disappear as a factor in European politics, obviously, but Westphalia ensured it would no longer be the primary legitimate reason for large-scale wars between states. Future conflicts would be driven much more by secular concerns: dynastic inheritance, trade, colonial rivalries, the balance of power. It set the template for international relations that lasted, in many ways, right up to the Napoleonic era. Hashtag outro.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's clear the 30 Years' War started from those deep structural cracks in the Holy Roman Empire, the unresolved religious tensions from Augsburg, the rise of Calvinism.
Yeah, but it was kept going and became so devastatingly brutal because of those broader forces: imperial rivalries, Habsburg versus Bourbon, the ambitions of princes, and just the sheer grinding necessity of feeding armies in the field. That logistical reality shaped so much of the conflict.
And the human cost remains just mind-boggling. That figure that only 3% of civilian deaths came from actual fighting, compared to 64% from plague, 12% from starvation. It really drives home the nature of warfare then. It wasn't just battle, it was societal collapse.
Absolutely. And the fact that the German lands took a century, until 1750, to get back to their pre-war population levels, that's a scar that lasted generations. It shows the totality of the destruction: environmental, economic, social.
It's also striking how long it took to actually end the war, even after the treaties were signed. You mentioned the last Swedish troops didn't leave Germany until 1654.
That's right, 6 years after Westphalia was signed. Demobilizing armies, settling local disputes, just the sheer administration of peace took an incredibly long time. It underscores how embedded the conflict had become.
Which creates this interesting contrast, doesn't it? You have this immediate, messy, drawn-out end on the ground. But the treaties themselves, Westphalia, represent this profound, almost clean structural shift in how Europe worked.
It's a fascinating tension. The peace didn't just stop the fighting. It really did establish a new framework for international order based on state sovereignty, non-interference, a recognized balance of power. And it makes you think, doesn't it? How often historically it seems to take these immense human tragedies, these catastrophic conflicts, to force such fundamental changes in how nations relate to each other. What did that pattern tell us about conflict resolution and political change even today?
A very sobering thought to leave our listeners with. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Okay, so if you've ever had to, reschedule a meeting or mark an anniversary, maybe just glance at your phone for the day. You're using something pretty profound.
You really are. It's one of the greatest inventions, honestly, but also one that caused, well, centuries of arguments. We're talking about the modern calendar.
Exactly. And today, we are diving into the source material, the deep story behind the Gregorian calendar. We want to get past just knowing the date.
We're looking at, the why behind it, this big 16th century religious crisis, the really clever math involved, and all the political drama. It actually meant for a long time, half the world was literally living 10 days ahead of the other half. It's wild.
It is wild. So our mission, for you, the learner, is pretty straightforward. We're taking this, let's be honest, dense pile of history and technical stuff and pulling out the core story. How did we end up agreeing on this very specific, very engineered 365.2425 day year? Why this system?
And, the starting point has to be the moment it all kicked off. The Gregorian calendar, it became the main civil calendar internationally accepted back in October 1582. It replaced the old Julian calendar.
Right.
And the immediate trigger, the thing they had to fix, was religious. It was about getting the date of Easter right, making it stable.
But the fix itself was just drastic.
Oh, yeah. To achieve that stability, they had to do something pretty radical.
It still blows my mind. To fix this calendar drift, the answer was just delete days. 10 whole days.
Poof, gone.
Thursday, October 4th, 1582. And the very next day was Friday, October 15th, 1582. I mean, just think about the chaos, the sheer administrative headache, the social confusion. What about rent?
Birthdays?
All just swallowed up by a papal decree. It's incredible.
So why? Why this 10-day hole in history? It all goes back centuries, doesn't it, to this basic flaw in the Julian calendar?
Yeah, the one Julius Caesar brought in way back in 45 BC. It governed the Western world for, well, over 1,500 years, but it wasn't quite perfect. Okay, let's unpack that core math problem. Caesar's system, it seemed elegant, right? Assumed the solar year was exactly 365 and a quarter days long.
365.25 days, which led to the simple rule, add a leap day every 4 years. Easy to remember, seemed to work okay.
For its time, yeah, but it was just slightly off.
Slightly, but crucially, yes. The actual time it takes Earth to orbit the sun, season to season, the tropical year, is more like 365.2422 days.
Okay, so the Julian calendar was overshooting it. By how much?
By about 11 minutes and 14 seconds every single year.
11 minutes. Doesn't sound like a disaster day to day. Why did that tiny error build up into this massive crisis for the church?
Because time keeps ticking. Those 11 minutes add up. Over 128 years or so, you've gained a whole extra day. Now think back to when the church first really standardized things. The First Council of Nicaea in AD 325. Fast forward over 12 centuries to the 1500s.
That error has compounded.
Massively. By the 16th century, the calendar was a full 10 days out of sync with the actual seasons. The spring equinox wasn't happening when the calendar said it should.
And this mattered fundamentally because of Easter. You mentioned the computus. What role did the equinox play there?
Right. The computus is the church's method for calculating Easter Sunday. The Nicaea Council back in 325 AD set the rule. The vernal equinox, the start of spring, is pegged to March 21st.
Okay.
Easter is then the first Sunday after the first ecclesiastical full moon that happens on or after March 21st. So that March 21st date is the anchor.
But because the Julian year was too long, the calendar date of March 21st was slowly drifting later and later compared to the actual astronomical start of spring.
Exactly. By the 1500s, the real spring equinox was happening around March 10th or 11th. But the church was still using March 21st for its calculation. They were 10 days late.
Which threw off the timing of Easter and presumably other related liturgical dates.
Completely. The holiest time of the Christian year was moving further and further away from the actual season it was meant to align with.
And looking at our sources, this wasn't some sudden realization in the 1500s. People knew about this problem for ages, right?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't a secret.
Right.
You can track the awareness growing. Way back in the 8th century, the Venerable Bede wrote that the error was already over 3 days.
Wow.
Then Roger Bacon, around 1200, he wrote to the Pope saying, look, this error is more like 7 or 8 days now. We really need to fix it.
Even Dante mentioned it.
Dante Alighieri, yeah, around 1300. He was aware that the calendar needed sorting out, so the knowledge was there.
A ticking time bomb, basically,
Yeah.
and the church just kept hitting snooze.
Well, there were attempts. Pope Sixtus V tried to get a reform going in 1475. He even brought a top astronomer, Regiomontanus, to Rome.
What?
Regiomontanus died soon after he arrived. Bad luck. And the whole project just fizzled out. It really took the Council of Trent in 1545 to give it the push it needed.
So what did the Council of Trent actually order them to do?
They officially gave the Pope Paul III at the time the authority to reform the calendar, and they were specific. 2 main jobs. First, fix the calendar immediately, get that spring equinox back to where it was around the time of Nicaea, so aligned with March 21st.
Right, undo the accumulated drift.
And second, figure out a way to stop it drifting in the future. A permanent solution.
Okay, that sounds like fixing the solar year length. But our sources mention another layer of complexity. The moon calculation was also off.
Yes, that's a really important point, often missed. It wasn't just the sun. The moon calculations for Easter were messed up, too.
How so?
The church used this thing called a 19-year cycle to predict the dates of full moons. These are ecclesiastical full moons, mind you, not always the exact astronomical ones. By 1582, this system had drifted too. The actual astronomical new moons were happening about 4 days earlier than the dates the church's tables predicted.
Oh, wow. So if Easter depends on the full moon after March 21st, and their date for March 21st was 10 days late, and their calculation for the full moon was 4 days late.
You got it. They were piling error on top of error. So the reform had to tackle both. Fix the length of the year and fix the way they calculated the lunar cycle for Easter. A double challenge.
Okay, so this complex, two-headed monster of a problem lands on the desk of Pope Gregory III.
Right. And he's the one who finally pushes it through with that famous papal bull Intergravissimus in February 1582.
But he didn't just dream it up. He had a commission. They sent out this compendium in 1577 with the plan.
Send it out to experts, mathematicians, astronomers across Europe for feedback.
And this is where we see that tension, right, between the pure science and what's actually practical for the church to implement.
Definitely. Our sources show there were some, like Giambattista Benedetti, arguing, look, if you want real accuracy, you should calculate Easter based on the actual observed movements of the sun and moon each year. Use real-time astronomy, basically.
Which sounds like the most accurate way, doesn't it? Why didn't they go for that?
Well, think about the implications. It would mean the date of Easter might not be known definitively years in advance. It could vary slightly depending on the observations. And crucially, it would require every church, everywhere, to have access to reliable, up-to-date astronomical data and the skills to use it.
Ah, practicalities.
Exactly. The commission decided against it. They prioritized stability, predictability, a universal rule, a tabular method that everyone could follow easily. They wanted a calendar cycle that repeated perfectly, even if that meant sacrificing that last tiny fraction of astronomical precision day to day.
So it was kind of an administrative decision?
Right.
Prioritizing consistency over hyper-accuracy?
You could say that. And the structure they landed on, the core mechanics, came largely from the work of an Italian doctor and astronomer, Aloysius Lilius, or Lilio.
He died before it was implemented, though, right?
He did, sadly. But his proposals were the mathematical engine driving the whole reform.
So what were his big ideas? How did he crack both the solar drift and the moon problem?
Well, his genius was really twofold. First, he came up with the new leap year rule, the one we still use, which tweaked the frequency of leap years. That was the fix for the solar year drift.
Okay, the famous rule. We'll get to the details of that. What was the second part?
The second part tackled the moon. He devised a clever mathematical scheme for adjusting something called the epochs over time.
Whoa, hang on. Epochs. That sounds technical. What are epochs and why did they need adjusting?
Okay, yeah, it's a bit niche. Basically, the epoch is just a number representing the age of the moon, in days, on a specific date, usually January 1st. This number helps determine the dates of the calculated new moons and full moons for the whole year in the church's system.
Got it.
Since the old lunar cycle was drifting, causing that 4-day error we mentioned, Lilius had to invent a new way to periodically adjust these epoch numbers. It's like adding mathematical corrections over the 19-year cycle to keep the calculated full moons roughly aligned with the actual astronomical ones. It was quite an elegant fix for the lunar side.
Okay, so Lilius provides the core math. But didn't he originally suggest a much slower fix for that built-up 10-day error, like taking 40 years to catch up?
He did, yeah. Lilius thought maybe just skipping a leap day every 4 years for 40 years would be gentler, less disruptive.
But that's not what happened.
No. The person who really pushed the whole thing through, defended it, and crucially advised on the implementation was the German Jesuit mathematician Christopher Clavius.
Ah, Clavius, he's the real architect in many ways.
He was the key figure in getting it finalized and accepted. He took Lilius's ideas, expanded on them hugely, wrote an 800-page defense of the reform, and fought off all the critics.
And Clavius was the one who said, no, let's do the 10-day jump all at once.
Yes. Clavius argued that the main goal, getting the equinox back to March 21st immediately for the sake of the Easter calculation, was more important than the short-term social disruption. He convinced Pope Gregory that they couldn't wait 40 years. The theological alignment was paramount.
Which led to that dramatic October jump in 1582.
Precisely. His advice sealed the deal on the immediate, sharp correction.
Okay, so let's nail down that famous leap year rule. This is the heart of the Gregorian calendar, the math that keeps it so accurate.
It really is the clever bit. It modifies the old Julian leap year every 4 years rule by adding 2 exceptions. These exceptions remove 3 leap days over a 400-year period.
Right. So step 1, any year divisible by 4 is a leap year. That's the basic Julian rule kept.
Correct. Step 2, except if the year is also divisible by 100. These are the century years like 1700, 1800, 1900. Even though they're divisible by 4, they are not leap years. That's where the first set of days gets removed.
Got it. 1700, 1800, 1900, no leap day. But there's an exception to the exception.
The third step, except if that century year is also divisible by 400.
Uh-huh. So 1600 was a leap year,
Yeah.
and 2000 was a leap year. But 2100, 2200, and 2300 will not be.
Exactly. By skipping the leap day in 3 out of 4 century years, 1700, 1800, 1900, but keeping it in 2000, then skipping 2100, 2200, 2300, keeping 2400, you end up with 97 leap days every 400 years instead of the Julian 100.
And that seemingly small change makes all the difference in accuracy.
It brings the average length of the calendar year to 365.2425 days.
Which translates to 365 days, 5 hours, 49 minutes, and 12 seconds.
Right. Compare that to the Julian 365.25 days. The improvement is huge. Remember, the Julian calendar was off by a day every 128 years.
And the Gregorian.
The Gregorian average is off by about 1 day every 3,030 years, relative to the mean probable year. It's vastly more accurate.
That's incredible engineering for the 16th century, all based on getting that 400-year cycle right.
And it creates this beautifully repeating pattern. The whole Gregorian calendar, dates and weekdays, repeats exactly every 400 years. That cycle contains precisely 146,097 days.
Of which 97 are leap days.
Yeah.
A self-contained, highly accurate system.
It was a remarkable achievement, and people wanted it, despite the confusion. Our sources mention the very first printed Gregorian calendar, the Lunario Novo, printed in 1582.
Oh, yeah.
Antoni Lelio, Aloysius's brother, actually got the exclusive rights to print it for 10 years. But the demand was so huge, apparently he couldn't keep up, and they had to revoke the exclusive rights pretty quickly.
Wow. People were clamoring for the correct date, even with that 10-day jump looming.
So the math is done. The Pope issues the bull, Inter Gravissimus, calendar fixed, right?
Well, mathematically fixed, yes, but the Pope's decree only directly applied to the Catholic Church itself and the lands he ruled directly, the Papal States.
Right. For it to become the civil calendar, the day-to-day calendar for laws, contracts, everything else, the secular rulers, the kings and princes, had to agree to adopt it.
And this is where pure science and theology slam into geopolitics.
Absolutely. Predictably, the main Catholic countries jumped on board almost immediately. Philip II of Spain was a major power.
Controlled Spain, Portugal, chunks of Italy.
Exactly. He ordered the change just days before it happened in October 1582.
So Spain, Portugal, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Papal States, they all experienced that weird jump from October 4th straight to October 15th, 1582.
France took a couple more months, but they did it too, jumping from December 9th to December 20th that same year. For them, it was a shock, but relatively quick.
The real drama, the centuries-long resistance, came from the Protestant and the Eastern Orthodox parts of the world.
Oh, yeah. They saw this as, Catholic meddling, a power play by the Pope, especially so soon after the Reformation had split Europe.
It was not just about dates, was it? It was symbolic. Accepting the Pope's calendar felt like accepting the Pope's authority.
Precisely. For many Protestant rulers who had specifically broken away from Rome, adopting Gregory's calendar was just politically impossible. It looked like bowing back down to papal authority.
So you ended up with this bizarre situation where Different parts of Europe were literally operating on different dates for centuries.
And the gap wasn't static, it actually grew.
How so?
Remember, the Gregorian rule skips the leap day in century years not divisible by 400. So 1700, 1800, 1900 were not leap years in Gregorian countries.
Okay.
But the Protestant and Orthodox countries, still using the Julian calendar, did have leap days in 1700, 1800, and 1900.
Ah, so every time the Gregorian calendar skipped a leap day that the Julian calendar kept, the difference between them increased by 1 day.
You got it. The initial 10-day gap in 1582 became an 11-day gap after 1700, then a 12-day gap after 1800, and a 13-day gap after 1900.
Wow. Okay, the most famous holdout is probably Great Britain and its empire, including the American colonies. They didn't switch until 1752.
A full 170 years after the initial reform. When Britain finally did it, they had to pass a specific act of parliament, the Calendar New Style, Act 1750.
And our sources point out something fascinating about that act.
Yeah, it's quite telling. They laid out the whole Gregorian leap year algorithm in the law divisible by 4, except by 100, almost by 400, but they never once mentioned Pope Gregory III or the papal bull Inter Gravissimus.
They basically copied the homework but pretended they came up with it themselves.
Pretty much. They presented it purely as a necessary civil adjustment by Parliament, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of its Catholic origins.
And by 1752, the gap was 11 days. So their jump, which they did in September 1752, involved deleting 11 days. Wednesday, September 2nd was followed by Thursday, September 14th.
Right. And you hear stories, maybe exaggerated, maybe not, about public confusion, even riots, people shouting, "Give us back our 11 days."
Whether riots happened or not, it must have been disruptive. But the British situation in 1752 was even more confusing because they made 2 big calendar changes at once.
Yes, that's crucial for anyone looking at documents from that era. It trips people up.
Okay, clarify the 2 changes for us.
First, they changed the start of the legal year. For centuries, England and Wales had officially started the new numbered year on March 25th, Lady Day. The act shifted the start to January 1st.
Okay, year start moved to Jan 1st. What was the second change?
The second change was actually adopting the Gregorian calendar system itself, which required dropping those 11 days in September 1752.
So that explains the weird double dating you sometimes see, like February 10th, 1750-61.
Exactly. Before the change, if it was February 1751, under the old system where the year didn't change until March 25th, it was still legally considered 1750. But people increasingly thought of the year starting January 1st, so they'd write both. 1750, old style, 1751, new style thinking.
God, that's confusing.
It is, and the Calendar Act had to fix that too. It decreed that January 1st, 1752 would be the definitive start of that year, which, incidentally, meant the year 1751 in England was incredibly short. It ran only from March 25th, 1751 to December 31st, 1751. Just 282 days long.
Huh. A short year. Meanwhile, Scotland had already sorted this out.
Yeah, the Scots were ahead of the game. They'd moved the start of their year to January 1st way back in 1600. So for 152 years, Scotland and England officially started their years on different dates.
The plot thickens. And the resistance lasted even longer in Eastern Europe, right, with the Orthodox churches.
Many Orthodox churches stuck with the Julian calendar for religious observances, and some countries kept it for civil purposes too, well into the 20th century. Russia switched its civil calendar in 1918, after the Bolshevik Revolution. They saw it as part of modernizing and aligning with the West. By then, the gap was 13 days, so they had a 13-day jump.
And the last European holdout was Greece.
Greece, yeah. They didn't adopt the Gregorian calendar for civil use until 1923, also a 13-day adjustment needed by that point. It means for decades you could travel across Europe and literally jump forward or backward nearly 2 weeks just by crossing a border.
We should also mention Turkey, which had its own unique, complicated system.
Right, the Ottoman Empire. Before 1917, they used the Islamic lunar calendar for most things, but the Julian calendar for government finances, their fiscal year. And the fiscal year started on March 1st.
A lunar calendar for society, a Julian solar calendar for taxes. That sounds messy.
It was incredibly complex. They had systems called escape years just to try and keep the fiscal calendar somewhat aligned. Eventually, they shifted the fiscal year to Gregorian standards starting March 1st, 1917, and then adopted it fully for all civil purposes on January 1st, 1926.
All this confusion, the dual dating. It leads to that classic historical footnote, the one everyone quotes.
Ah, Shakespeare and Cervantes. The textbook example of why old style, OS, and new style, NS, mattered.
They both died on April 23rd, 1616. Sounds like an amazing coincidence.
Except it's not really simultaneous. Cervantes died in Spain, which was already using the Gregorian calendar, new style. Shakespeare died in England, which was still using the Julian calendar, old style.
And in 1616, the difference was still 10 days.
Exactly. So although the date on the page is the same, Cervantes actually died 10 days before Shakespeare in real astronomical terms. It's a phantom coincidence created entirely by the two different calendar systems running side by side.
Okay, so we've wrestled with the big political adoption headaches. Let's talk about something that seems simpler, but wasn't. When does the year actually start? We take January 1st for granted now.
We really do, but historically it was all over the place. January 1st wasn't always the default.
During the Middle Ages, especially under church influence, there were several competing start dates.
Oh, yes. You find records where the year number ticks over on Christmas, December 25th, sometimes even Easter, which is a nightmare for historians because Easter moves.
Right.
But a very common one, particularly in England and its sphere of influence, was March 25th, Lady Day, the Feast of the Annunciation.
And that March 25th start date held on in England right up until that big change in 1752. Which means, again, you have to be really careful reading old documents.
Absolutely. The classic example is the execution of King Charles I. Contemporary records from Parliament often date it January 30th, 1648.
Because in their system, the year 1649 didn't officially begin until March 25th.
Precisely. So January and February 1649 were still legally part of 1648. If you read that date literally today, you'd put the event in the wrong year. Later histories, using our modern January 1st start, correctly label it 1649.
It really hammers home why that 1752 Act had to do both things. Change the calendar system and change the start date of the year. It was a fundamental reset.
A massive shift in how time was legally structured. And again, Scotland had already made that switch to January 1st back in 1600. More Anglo-Scottish divergence.
Okay, so the year's length changed, the start date changed. But the basic building blocks, the months themselves, they stayed the same, didn't they? Rooted way back in Roman times.
That's right. The Gregorian reform kept the 12 Julian months with their familiar names and lengths, mostly. And those names are a direct link back to the very early Roman calendar, supposedly from Romulus around 750 BC.
Let's quickly trace some of those origins.
January.
Named for Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings, endings, doorways, transitions. Makes sense for the start.
Yep.
From February, an ancient Roman purification festival held in that month.
March. Seems obvious.
Mars, the god of war. Likely because military campaigns often began in spring after the winter lull.
April's a bit fuzzy, though, isn't it?
It is. Some scholars think it comes from the Latin aperire, meaning to open, like buds opening in spring. Others suggest a link to the goddess Aphrodite via Etruscan intermediaries. The jury's still out on April. Then we get the explicitly political months.
Yeah, July and August. No ambiguity there.
Yeah.
July was originally Quintilis, the 5th month. It was renamed in 44 BC to honor Julius Caesar, born in that month.
In August.
That was Sextilis, the 6th month. Renamed in 8 BC to honor the first emperor, Augustus. He chose that month, apparently, because several key events in his rise to power happened then.
And then comes my favorite historical glitch. The names September, October, November, December.
Huh? Yes, the big giveaway. Their names literally mean 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th month.
But they're months 9, 10, 11, and 12 in our calendar.
Exactly. It shows that our current 12-month system evolved from an earlier Roman calendar that probably only had 10 months, starting in March. They later added January and February at the beginning, shifting everything else down 2 spots.
But nobody ever bothered to rename September through December to match their new positions.
Nope. They just stayed as Septem, Octo, Novem, Decem. It's a perfect example of historical inertia. Once something's established, even if it's illogical, it tends to stick.
It really does. And speaking of sticking, because the month lengths are so irregular, 30 days, 31, sometimes 28 or 29, we still use those old mnemonics to remember them.
Absolutely necessary. The famous rhyme, 30 days hath September.
Our sources track that back surprisingly far, didn't they? To the 15th century.
Yeah, the earliest known version is apparently some handwritten notes in the margin of a document from around 1425, in Middle English, no less.
Wow.
And then there's the other classic, the knuckle mnemonic.
Right. Knuckles are 31 days. The dips between are the shorter months. Symbol, physical, effective. Still taught today.
So, the Gregorian calendar. A massive leap forward in accuracy, correcting the Julian system's error from 1 day every 128 years down to about 1 day every 3,030 years. Pretty impressive.
Hugely impressive for the 16th century, but
Yeah.
not perfect, right? Even Lilius and Clavius couldn't account for everything.
That's right. And this is where it gets even more subtle. There are still tiny inaccuracies, and they come from two different places. First, there's that remaining small error compared to the average length of the tropical year, that 1 day drift every 3 millennia or so. We know about that one.
Right.
But second, and more complex, is how the calendar performs relative to the actual moment of the astronomical vernal equinox each year.
Why is that different from the average year length? Why is the equinox itself hard to pin down perfectly?
Because the Earth isn't a perfect clockwork machine. Its movements have variations. The timing of the equinoxes is affected by things like the precession, that slow wobble of the Earth's axis over thousands of years, and also tiny long-term changes in Earth's orbital speed and tilt.
So the precise moment spring actually starts isn't fixed. It shifts around a bit year to year and over long periods.
Exactly. It's a moving target, astronomically speaking. The Gregorian calendar, with its fixed 400-year cycle of leap days, is trying to approximate this slightly variable natural phenomenon with a rigid mathematical rule.
Which means even within the Gregorian system, the calendar date of the equinox, or solstice, isn't perfectly stable.
Correct. It still oscillates back and forth by a couple of days over the centuries. For example, our sources note the December solstice. The latest it has occurred on the Gregorian calendar was December 23rd, back in 1903.
Yep.
But the earliest it's predicted to occur will be December 20th in the year 2096. That's a variation of over 2 days, all happening within the rules of the Gregorian system. It shows the limits of trying to impose human order on cosmic cycles.
And then there's the really, really long-term issue, the one that no calendar system short of constant tweaking can truly solve.
Ah, yes, the big one. The Earth's rotation is slowing down.
Making each day infinitesimally longer over time.
Right. Tidal friction from the moon, mainly. It's incredibly slow, but it's measurable. Over thousands and thousands of years, this means more days will fit into one orbit around the sun.
So because the Gregorian calendar defines the year as a fixed number of fixed-length days, 365.2425 of them, it will eventually fall behind the seasons again, just because the day itself is getting longer.
Exactly. The calendar year will become slightly shorter than the actual orbital year. So eventually, maybe tens of thousands of years from now, the vernal equinox will drift back from March 21st to March 20th, then March 19th. A future calendar reform will be needed.
Which means people haven't stopped thinking about calendar accuracy since 1582. There have been proposals to make the Gregorian system even better.
Oh, yeah. People are always trying to refine it. The most famous proposal came from the 19th century astronomer Sir John Herschel.
What did he suggest?
A relatively simple tweak, actually. He suggested that the year 4000 and multiples of 4000, like 8000, 12,000, should not be leap years, even though the current Gregorian rule says they should be, since they're divisible by 400.
How would skipping the leap day in the year 4000 help?
It would make the average Gregorian year slightly shorter, dropping from 365.2425 days to 365.24225 days. You'd have 969 leap days every 4,000 years instead of the current 970.
And that shorter average year is closer to the actual mean tropical year.
Yes, much closer. It basically cancels out most of that 1 day in 3,000 years error we mentioned earlier, pushing any significant drift much, much further into the future. It's a clever fine-tuning.
But it's never been officially adopted, has it?
No, it remains just a proposal. Interesting theoretically, but no authority has actually mandated skipping the leap day in 4000 AD. We'll have to wait and see if our descendants do.
It just shows the ongoing human fascination with perfecting timekeeping. And Herschel's idea is just one. There are other more radical calendar reform ideas out there too, right?
Absolutely. The search for the ideal calendar continues. You see proposals that aim for more regularity, like the International Fixed Calendar with 13 months of 28 days each, or the World Calendar with equal quarters.
And things like leap week calendars.
Yeah, systems like Symmetry 444 or the Henke-Henry Permanent Calendar. These often try to create a calendar where every date falls on the same day of the week every single year. They're aiming for maximum predictability and simplicity, often abandoning the traditional month structure entirely.
Fascinating stuff. Okay, so let's quickly recap our deep dive here. The Gregorian calendar reform, it was fundamentally a 16th century religious fix.
Driven by the need to correct the date of Easter, which had drifted 10 days off due to the inaccuracy of the old Julian calendar. mandated by the Council of Trent.
The solution was based on the sophisticated mathematics of Lilius and especially Clavius. They introduced that new leap year rule, skipping 3 leap days every 400 years.
And also a system to fix the lunar calculations for Easter. This resulted in a much more accurate average year length, 365.2425 days.
But implementing it was politically explosive. Catholic nations jumped immediately in 1582, creating that 10-day gap overnight.
While Protestant and Orthodox nations resisted, sometimes for centuries, viewing it as papal overreach, this led to growing discrepancies 11, 12, 13 days, and the historical headache of old-style versus new-style dating.
Which brings us neatly to a final thought for you, the listener. Something rooted in how we handle this complex history today. We mentioned that historians usually keep the original Julian dates for events before 1582, like the Battle of Agincourt being October 25th, 1415 OS.
Right, and our sources specifically warn against casually using what's called the proleptic Gregorian calendar for those early dates.
Proleptic just means applying the Gregorian rules backwards in time before the system actually existed.
Exactly. Calculating what the date would have been if Gregory's rules had been in effect back then. But doing that creates dates that the people living at the time would never have recognized. They lived by Julian dates.
So the question this raises is, if our historical records, the primary sources, use old-style dates, how much does our understanding of history depend on knowing the specific rules of timekeeping used at that moment?
We saw the Shakespeare-Cervantes example how a seemingly shared date masked a 10-day difference. What other historical connections, sequences, or perceived simultaneities might be subtly distorted because we're looking back through the filter of our modern, standardized Gregorian lens?
The calendar isn't just a neutral grid. It actively shapes how we perceive and relate events across time.
It really does. Something worth thinking about next time you encounter a date from deep history.
A fantastic point to end on. That wraps up our deep dive into the day the world decided to jump ahead.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a conflict that is, well, absolutely essential viewing if you want to understand the DNA of modern European geopolitics, even if it's maybe less famous than some of its neighbors. We are talking about the War of the League of Cambrai, fought between 1508 and 1516.
Yeah, this is really a masterclass in shifting alliances, isn't it? It's a period of the wider Italian wars, those conflicts from 1494 to 1559 that just defines instability.
Right.
If you tried to teach this conflict using a static map, you'd fail miserably. Because every 6 months, it feels like, the map and who was fighting whom completely changed.
Absolutely. And the conflict involved pretty much every major player you can think of at the time. France, the Holy Roman Empire, the Papal States, and of course the wealthy Republic of Venice. They were the sort of continuous anchors throughout.
They were the constants, yeah. But the sheer roster of supporting players is what makes this deep dive so necessary, I think. You've got Spain, England, the formidable Swiss Confederacy, Florence, Milan, and even smaller but really influential states like Ferrara. Everyone jumped in at some point. It was like a total European immersion into the chaos of the Italian peninsula.
And the central narrative arc here is just fascinating. The war kicks off with this massive, almost unprecedented coalition, the League of Cambrai, formed with one single goal: to completely dismember the Republic of Venice.
Wipe it off the map, basically.
Exactly. Yet 8 years later, what happens? Venice is still standing, it's allied with France, and they've successfully defeated the very coalition that tried to destroy them. It's incredible.
It really is. So our mission today, if you will, is to chart that extraordinary volatility. We need to look at the rapid disintegration and then the reformation of 2 massive multinational alliances, the League of Cambrai and then its successor, the Holy League. We need to reveal how the map of Italy was constantly being, violently redrawn, only to ultimately result in what has to be history's greatest punchline. A return almost exactly to the status quo of 1508.
It's a study in betrayal, pure ambition, and eventually just financial exhaustion, isn't it?
Completely.
Let's start at the very root of this conflict, then. We need to go back to the political ambitions of the Papal States in the early 1500s.
Right. To really get why the League of Cambrai even formed, we have to rewind just a little bit to the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI. His entire project was, well, deeply intertwined with the actions of his illegitimate son, Caesar Borgia.
Caesar Borgia, He wasn't just some political figurehead, was he? He was a highly capable military commander, the gonfalonier of the papal armies, and his father's ambition, Pope Alexander's ambition, was to carve out this huge, consolidated, permanent papal state in central Italy.
Exactly. Replacing all those fragmented local lordships with one unified authority under, effectively, Borgia control.
And Caesar focused specifically on the Romagna region, right? This area in central Italy that was theoretically under papal control, but functionally independent.
That's right. It was ruled by various families, like the Bentivoglio and Bologna. Cesare was actually extremely successful in pushing these families out. He was establishing what looked very much like a new Borgia dynasty state. It was quite effective for a time.
But, as often happens in Italian history, it seems, power hinged entirely on the lifespan of one man. Pope Alexander VI died suddenly in August 1503.
And poof, the Borgia enterprise just evaporated, almost overnight.
And this power vacuum, it was seized upon immediately by local powers, wasn't it?
Instantly. The deposed lords of those Romagna cities, you mentioned Rimini, Faenza, Servia, they suddenly found themselves desperate. They knew they couldn't fight the Pope on their own, whoever the next Pope was, but they could appeal to the Republic of Venice for protection.
Ah, Venice. Always opportunistic.
Always. So these local lords offered Venice submission, they offered annual tribute in exchange for military aid and, crucially, governance. And Venice, always eager to secure strategic buffer zones and expand its mainland holdings, the terra firma, happily took possession of those key cities by the end of 1503.
Which, from the papacy's perspective, must have looked like outright theft.
Absolutely. Pure theft of papal territory.
Yeah.
And this really sets the stage for the arrival of the next major player, Pope Julius II. He secured the papacy after the very short reign of Pius III, and Julius II was nicknamed the Warrior Pope.
And for good reason, apparently.
Oh, absolutely. He was determined, ruthless, and, frankly, highly secular in his political goals. He wanted papal power restored.
So his first move was getting Cesare Borgia out of the way.
Exactly. He secured control of the papal armies by arresting and imprisoning Cesare. Then, Julius II declared his primary goal, the reestablishment of full, undeniable papal control over the Romagna. Those cities Venice held.
And how did Venice respond to this? They couldn't just ignore the Pope.
Well, their response really defined the coming conflict. They were pragmatic, they offered Julius II annual tribute, they acknowledged papal sovereignty over the cities in theory, but they refused to surrender actual governance or direct control.
A subtle distinction, maybe.
To Julius, it was a distinction without a difference. He needed sovereignty and control. He wasn't interested in symbolic gestures. This became the absolute core friction point that eventually drove Europe to war. It's all about those Romanian cities.
So Julius II knew he couldn't take on Venice alone, even with his warrior pope reputation. What did he do?
He was powerful, but not that powerful. He spent the next few years securing his own borders closer to Rome. He successfully reconquered Bologna and Perugia states that had kind of drifted into quasi-independence, sitting awkwardly between papal and Venetian territories.
Smart consolidation first.
Right. By 1507, having secured his flank, he knew he needed an external catalyst, some bigger power to help him hit Venice. And he found that in Maximilian I, the king of the Romans and, the prospective Holy Roman Emperor.
Okay, so this brings us right to the immediate prelude. The imperial pretext in early 1508. Maximilian uses this traditional excuse, a journey to Rome for his imperial coronation.
The Italian Zug, literally the journey to Italy. But everyone, absolutely everyone, knew it was really a thinly veiled attempt to assert imperial rights in Italy and, well, maybe grab some territory while he was at it.
So Maximilian asks for passage through Venetian territory in February 1508.
And Venice, knowing full well this was likely a ruse, flatly refused him. They weren't playing along. So when Maximilian's forces entered their territory anyway,
Venice was ready.
They were ready.
Yeah.
And what a fight it turned out to be. The Venetian army, led by a very capable general, Bartolomeo d'Alviano, met the Imperials and just decisively defeated Maximilian's troops at the Battle of Cadore in March 1508.
Wow, okay. A straight-up defeat for the emperor to be.
And even more surprising than the victory itself was the Venetian counteroffensive. They didn't just repel the invaders, they went on the attack. They seized huge amounts of land that had historically belonged to the Habsburgs.
Like what?
We're talking the entire county of Gorizia, Austrian Ischia, that's peasant Trieste, Fiume, even parts of Carniola. It was a massive land grab.
Which forced Maximilian's hand.
Absolutely. Maximilian was also distracted by revolts elsewhere in his vast domains. So this defeat and land loss forced him to conclude a 3-year truce with Venice.
Okay, now, this seems pivotal. Venice signs a separate truce with Maximilian in the summer of 1508.
Yes, and here's the crucial political misstep, the pivot that shifts everything. They did this without informing or even consulting Louis XII of France.
Who was technically their most important ally at the time.
Exactly, their main partner against the Habsburgs. Louis XII viewed this as just an unforgivable act of treachery. Political arrogance on Venice's part.
You can see why. Imagine your partner making a unilateral peace deal with your shared enemy and taking all the spoils, too.
Precisely. So Louis XII immediately pivoted. He went from seeing Venice as an ally against the Habsburgs to seeing Venice as a target ripe for revenge. The political stage was now perfectly set for creating an anti-Venetian super-alliance.
Okay, so that perceived betrayal by Venice, coupled with Pope Julius II's, shall we say, undying resentment over the Romagna cities,
Yeah.
it all comes together in December 1508. What was the specific final spark, and how quickly did this monster alliance actually form?
The final spark was just pure defiance by Venice against papal authority. Venice unilaterally appointed its own candidate to the vacant bishopric of Vicenza. They completely ignored the Pope, papal procedure, everything.
Which to Julius II wasn't just politics.
No, it was a direct insult to the religious sovereignty of the Holy See. He couldn't let it stand. So the Pope called for all Christian nations to join him in what he framed as a holy expedition to subdue the arrogant Venetians. And on December 10th, 1508, the League of Cambrai was formally concluded. It was, frankly, a diplomatic coup of the First Order.
It sounds incredibly formidable. Who were the core members again?
The four core signatories were the papacy, obviously, under Julius II, France under Louis XII, hungry for revenge, the Holy Roman Empire under Maximilian I, wanting his lands back, and Spain under Ferdinand II, always looking for an advantage. This alliance was built purely on mutual greed and a shared desire to curb Venice's immense wealth and power.
And the sources, they reveal something really shocking about this agreement, don't they? It wasn't just a vague promise to fight Venice. They actually drew up a detailed partition plan.
Oh yeah, it's breathtakingly specific. It reads like a corporate takeover plan, outlining exactly who gets what piece of the Venetian Republic after they dismantle it.
Okay, break it down for us. Who was promised what?
All right, so Maximilian, I was promised the big mainland cities. Verona, Vicenza, Padua, plus the whole region of Friuli, and all the territories Venice had just taken from him, like Gorizia and Trieste.
So he gets his revenge and more?
Pretty much. France, under Louis XII, was set to annex Brescia, Crema, Bergamo, and Cremona, basically adding them to the French Duchy of Milan.
Expanding French Italy.
Ferdinand of Spain was promised the Apulian ports down south, particularly Otranto, and the papacy. Julius II would finally get Rimini, Ravenna, and the rest of the Romagna. Essentially, everyone gets a slice of the Venetian pie.
Wow. When geopolitical heavyweights like that unite with such a clear plan, the consequences must have been immediate and brutal for Venice.
They were. France declared war in April 1509. But Julius II, he unleashed a weapon that was maybe even more terrifying in that era.
The interdict.
Yes, on April 27, 1509, Pope Julius II imposed the interdict on the entire Republic of Venice. And you have to remember, the interdict was arguably the most potent spiritual weapon a pope had. It didn't just excommunicate a few leaders.
It banned an entire region, right? What did that actually mean for the average person living in Venice or its territories?
It meant total religious and social chaos. No mass could be celebrated publicly, no sacraments, baptism, marriage, last rites could be administered, no proper Christian burials in consecrated ground, no religious services of any kind.
So it essentially told the Venetian population that their own government was condemned by God?
Exactly. It was designed to generate massive internal pressure on the Venetian Senate to give in to the Pope's demands, to break the public's loyalty to the Republic. A truly devastating psychological blow.
And the military campaign was just as devastating, initially at least.
Oh, catastrophic for Venice at the start. The initial phase culminated in the Battle of Agnadello on May 14, 1509. And Agnadello really exposed the critical weakness of the Venetian military system at the time.
Which was?
Their reliance on hired mercenary generals, the condottieri. The Venetian army was commanded by two cousins, Bartolomeo d'Alviano, remember him from Cadore, and Nicola B. Pitiliano. They had very different temperaments, and crucially, they violently disagreed on strategy.
Internal conflict in command. Never good.
Never good. Pitiliano favored a cautious, defensive, delaying strategy. Alviano, who had just won that victory at Cadore, was impetuous, aggressive. He wanted to fight.
So what happened at Agnadello?
Well, Alviano was commanding the Venetian rear guard. He got attacked by the main French force under Louis XII himself. Despite being outnumbered, Alviano engaged. He sent frantic requests for reinforcements back to Pitiliano, who was commanding the main body of the army ahead.
And
Pitigliano refused. Whether it was professional jealousy, genuine strategic caution, or maybe a bit of both, we don't know for sure. He explicitly ordered Alviano to break off the engagement and retreat.
But Alviano didn't listen.
He ignored the order. He kept fighting, and his division was subsequently surrounded and just absolutely annihilated by the French. Pitigliano, seeing the destruction unfold from a distance, simply continued his retreat, abandoning Alviano and his men.
The military fallout must have been immediate.
Complete. The Venetian collapse on the mainland was total and shocking. Within weeks, they lost nearly all the terra firma territory they had accumulated over the previous century. Louis XII just walked into lands without resistance. The major cities, Padua, Verona, Vicenza, they quickly surrendered to imperial emissaries, hoping probably to get better terms from Maximilian than from the vengeful French.
And other players jumped in too.
Oh yes. Alfonso d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara, saw his chance. He joined the League, seized the Polesine region from Venice, and even captured the city of Ravenna for the Pope. It really looked like Venice, the great maritime and economic powerhouse, was just moments away from complete extinction.
But history rarely moves in straight lines, does it? This is where things start to turn again. We get the first major counterpunch, the Padua Revolt.
Exactly. The League had won the war on paper, incredibly quickly, but they hadn't won over the people. The new imperial governors, especially in cities like Padua, they rapidly became immensely unpopular.
Why was that?
Well, they were foreign, often seen as rapacious, taxing heavily, and their methods of governance were just much harsher, more autocratic than the generally pragmatic, if sometimes demanding, Venetian rule the cities were used to.
So this unpopularity created an opening.
A perfect opening. In mid-July 1509, barely 2 months after the disaster at Agnadello, the citizens of Padua revolted. They were aided by Venetian cavalry under the command of Andrea Gritti, a name we'll hear again. They managed to expel the imperial garrison and restore the city to Venetian control.
That must have been a huge psychological boost for Venice.
Colossal. It proved that Venetian loyalty wasn't completely dead on the mainland. But Maximilian, I was furious at this reversal. He assembled a truly massive Franco-Spanish imperial army, reportedly the largest European army seen in Italy up to that point in the century, specifically to retake Padua.
So he besieges the city. This seems like the moment the League should have crushed the revolt and finished Venice off for good. Why did the siege fail?
Yeah, you'd think so. But it failed primarily due to, well, logistics and resolve. The massive coalition army was surprisingly disorganized, it was slow to get going, and it just lacked the political cohesion, the unified command needed for a difficult, sustained siege. Pitigliano, the cautious Venetian general, actually had enough time to get into Padua and organize the defense, concentrating the remaining Venetian forces there. And even though the French and imperial artillery did manage to breach the city walls in several places,
The defenders held.
the Venetian defense, reportedly very determined, held firm. Maximilian, who was known for being easily distracted and frankly lacking in patience for long sieges, simply lifted the siege in October 1509. He withdrew back to Tyrol, using the onset of winter as his official excuse. That failure, that withdrawal, was Venice's lifeline.
It gave them breathing room.
Exactly. Breathing room to try and reassert control. Pitigliano actually went back on the offensive, recapturing several smaller cities. However, Venice also suffered another major setback that December. Alfonso d'Este's Ferrare's naval forces managed to confront and destroy a significant part of the Venetian galley fleet anchored in the Po River. That was the Battle of Polsella, a real blow to Venice's traditional claim to naval supremacy, even on the rivers.
Okay, so despite that crucial reprieve at Padua, Venice was still in a terrible position, right? Financially drained, militarily battered. They had to negotiate, didn't they? Moving into 1510.
Absolutely exhausted. They realized they had to make peace with someone, and the most logical target was Pope Julius II, since the original fight was primarily about his claims. So they negotiated, and in February 1510, they accepted incredibly harsh peace terms.
How harsh? What did they have to give up?
Oh, punishingly harsh. Designed to permanently cripple Venice's power and restore papal dignity. They had to return all the Romagnan cities, Rimini, Faenza, Servia, the original Casus Belli. They had to pay huge reparations. And, critically, they had to give up their traditional state power to appoint clergy within their own territory.
Wow, that's a huge concession for a state like Venice.
Massive. And they also lost all legal jurisdiction over papal subjects residing within Venice itself. It was a profound humiliation for the proud republic. But Julius II, having achieved his primary war aim, was satisfied. He formally revoked the interdict on February 24, 1510. It looked like the Papal-Venetian conflict was finally over.
But there's a twist, isn't there?
Yeah.
Something about Venetian realpolitik.
Oh, this is a truly remarkable moment. It speaks volumes about the cynical nature of governance back then. Even as their ambassadors were in Rome, receiving papal absolution and agreeing to these terms back in Venice, the powerful Council of Ten secretly passed a resolution.
What did it say?
It stated that these harsh terms were accepted under duress, under threat, and therefore the Republic considered them invalid and non-binding.
So they secretly nullified the treaty while publicly agreeing to it.
Pretty much. They planned to adhere to it publicly for now, but fully intended to violate its terms the moment the political winds shifted back in their favor. It's an incredible level of institutional duplicity, but it's documented.
That really shows the long-term thinking of the Venetian oligarchy, doesn't it? Compared to maybe the more personal rule of monarchs.
Absolutely. They were playing the long game, betting on the inherent instability of the coalition that had attacked them. And they were right to bet on that breakdown because Pope Julius II very quickly developed a new enemy, France.
Ah, the great pivot begins. Why France now?
Well, having recovered the Romagna, the Pope suddenly looked around northern Italy and realized something alarming. The French military presence in Milan, which they controlled directly, and influencing allies like Ferrara, was now a far more immediate and potentially existential threat to papal ambitions than the significantly weakened Republic of Venice. French power looked overwhelming.
So fear of French dominance drove the next major shift. What was the immediate spark this time?
Interestingly, the immediate friction point was with Alfonso d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara, who was a crucial French ally. The official reason given was a dispute over a salt monopoly license. Always follow the money, right? And Alfonso's continued skirmishing against the remaining Venetian forces down in the Polesine region.
But the real goal was bigger.
Much bigger. Julius formulated a plan to seize the Duchy of Ferrara itself and add it directly to the Papal States. This would push the papal border significantly northwards and directly challenge French influence in the region. It was incredibly ambitious.
But he couldn't do that alone. He needed allies again.
His own forces were definitely insufficient against Ferrara and its powerful French backers. So he did two audacious things. First, he hired Swiss mercenaries, the best infantry in Europe, to launch an attack on the French in Milan, a direct challenge.
Wow.
And second, most importantly, he completely reversed course on Venice. He invited the Republic, his recent enemy whom he just humiliated, to become his ally against Louis XII of France.
And Venice, having secretly decided the peace treaty was invalid anyway?
They readily accepted the offer. Why wouldn't they? It was their chance to get back at France and maybe recover some losses. So by July 1510, the League of Cambrai was effectively dead. The massive anti-Venetian coalition had completely collapsed. Now it was France and its ally Ferrara standing against this new, very surprising, Veneto-Papal alliance.
The warrior pope strikes again. Did he go on the offensive immediately?
Instantly. The new papal Venetian forces captured the city of Modena in August 1510. Then Julius II used his spiritual authority once more, excommunicating Alfonso d'Este, providing the religious justification he needed for his planned invasion of Ferrara.
And we have to emphasize, Julius II wasn't just directing this from Rome, was he?
Not at all. This is what makes him so remarkable. In the dead of winter, January 1511, he took personal command of the papal and Venetian forces besieging the fortress town of Mirandola near Ferrara. He was right there in the trenches, reportedly, braving the snow and cannon fire.
Incredible. And they won.
Yes, Mirandola fell. It was a papal victory, largely due to Julius's personal leadership-boosting morale. It gave him immense prestige across Europe. He then marched triumphantly towards Bologna, expecting the rest of the campaign against Ferrara to follow smoothly.
Bologna, that city seems to have been a persistent problem for the papacy.
A huge problem. The popular hostility towards direct papal rule, which had simmered under the Borgias, definitely continued under Julius II. The Bolognese populace was openly resistant. They certainly weren't eager to fight a major power like France just for Pope Julius's sake.
So what happened when the French showed up?
In May 1511, a French army, commanded by the veteran general Gian Giacomo Trivulzio, approached Bologna. The citizens didn't wait. They revolted against the papal governor, threw their allegiance back to the French, and literally opened the city gates. Julius II was forced to flee in utter chaos, heading towards Ravenna.
Wow, another dramatic reversal, and this incident sparked even more instability.
Incredible instability. Julius, furious and humiliated, blamed his defeat entirely on his military commander, who happened to be his own nephew, Francesco Maria della Rovere, the Duke of Urbino.
And Urbino didn't take kindly to being scapegoated.
Not at all.
Mhm.
Feeling he was being unfairly blamed, Urbino responded by publicly confronting and then murdering Cardinal Aladossi, the man Julius had actually left in charge of Bologna's defense when he marched off to Mirandola.
Good grief. The Pope's top general murdering a cardinal in public?
The sheer chaos is hard to overstate. You have the Pope running for his life, his top general committing murder. It completely underscored the vulnerability and the, frankly, often brutal nature of the papal state at this time. And Louis XII of France, never missing an opportunity, seized the moment. He called for an ecclesiastical council to meet in Pisa with the explicit goal of deposing Pope Julius II.
So a full-blown existential crisis for the papacy.
Absolutely. And this crisis, this direct French threat to the Pope himself, led directly, once again, to the formation of the second great coalition of this war, the one we call the Holy League.
Okay, so if the League of Cambrai was primarily about greed, everyone wanting a piece of Venice, the Holy League, formed on October 4th, 1511, sounds like it was driven more by fear, specifically fear of French dominance in Italy and the threat to the Pope himself.
That's a very good way to put it. Fear of France was the glue this time. The Papal States, naturally, and Venice were the core, now united against their former ally, France. They were immediately joined by Spain.
Ferdinand II again. What was his angle this time?
Ever the pragmatist. Ferdinand saw this anti-French alliance as a golden opportunity. First, to finally seize the Kingdom of Navarre, which straddled the Pyrenees, and which France also had claims on. And second, to gain a stronger foothold for Spain in French-held Lombardy, always expanding Spanish influence.
And then England gets involved.
Yes, the rising power of England under the young and ambitious Henry VIII, joined later via the Treaty of Westminster. Henry saw it as his chance to make a name for himself on the continent and perhaps recapture historical English territories in northern France, like Calais or even Aquitaine. Old claims die hard.
And the muscle. Who is going to do the heavy lifting on the ground against the French army?
The indispensable element. The Swiss Confederacy. The Swiss infantry, the pike squares, were widely considered the dominant land force in Europe at the time. The papacy hired vast numbers of them to serve as the Holy League's primary shock troops against the French in Italy.
It's interesting to note who isn't a core member this time. Maximilian I, the emperor.
Right. Maximilian avoided officially joining the Holy League. He was probably wary after his previous failures and lack of funds. But critically, he had concluded a truce with Venice back in April or May of 1512. This effectively ended his participation in any anti-Venetian action. The strategic shift was complete. The target was now unequivocally France.
So the French, facing this new multi-pronged threat, how did they respond?
They recognized the severity immediately. They appointed Gaston de Foix, Louis XII's brilliant young nephew, as their commander in Italy. Foix was incredibly energetic and aggressive. He quickly moved south, successfully checking a Spanish advance on Bologna. Then he marched north again.
Towards Brescia.
Yes, Brescia had revolted against French rule, encouraged by the Venetians. Foix besieged and then brutally sacked the city. It was a ruthless display of force that restored French prestige in the short term, but certainly earned him and the French few friends among the Italian populace.
And after Brescia, Foix marched towards Ravenna.
Correct. He wanted to force a decisive battle with the main Holy League army, which was primarily Spanish and papal troops under the command of the Spanish general Ramon de Cardona. Foix besieged Ravenna, knowing Cardona would have to come and relieve it. This led directly to the massive, incredibly bloody Battle of Ravenna, fought on Easter Sunday, April 11th, 1512.
And the outcome?
It was, tactically speaking, a decisive Franco-Ferraris victory. They smashed the Spanish infantry lines, considered among the best in Europe, and forced a complete rout of the Holy League army. A huge win on paper.
There's always a but in this war, isn't there?
There always is. The victory came at an immense and arguably fatal cost. Gaston de Foix, the brilliant young commander, the driving force behind the French campaign, was killed during the final cavalry pursuit of the retreating Spanish.
So the crucial question, was that tactical victory actually worth the strategic loss of their commander? How much did Foix's personality hold that French campaign together?
Tremendously, it seems. Foix wasn't just a successful general. He was the political link back to King Louis XII. He had the energy, the charisma, the command authority to direct all the disparate French forces in Italy. His death created an immediate vacuum at the top. Despite the great victory, the French momentum was just lost instantly.
And the Holy League capitalized on this.
Oh, Pope Julius II, relentless, even after the defeat at Ravenna, immediately hired yet another large army of Swiss mercenaries. They descended from the Alps straight towards Milan, bringing with them Maximilian Sforza, the son of the previous Duke Ludovico il Moro, who Louis XII had deposed years earlier. They aimed to put a Sforza back on the ducal throne.
So the combination of Foix's death, the resulting loss of French morale, and this huge Swiss push.
It was just too much for the now leaderless French army. By August 1512, only a few months after their great victory at Ravenna, the French forces were completely driven out of Milan. They were forced to retreat back across the Alps. Maximilian Sforza was installed as Duke of Milan, essentially propped up by Swiss military power.
So the Holy League had actually succeeded in its main goal, kicking the French out of Italy, at least for the time being.
Yes, temporarily neutralized the French threat. But this main conflict in Italy had also, as you might expect, bled over into wider European wars, didn't it?
Right. You mentioned Navarre.
Indeed. Spain successfully used this period between 1512 and 1515 to complete its conquest of Iberian Navarre, the southern part of the kingdom. This effectively pushed French influence entirely off the Iberian Peninsula, a major strategic win for Ferdinand.
And Henry VIII's intervention in France?
Henry VIII launched his invasion. He secured a notable, if perhaps overhyped, Anglo-imperial victory over the French cavalry at the Battle of the Spurs in August 1513. It was more famous for the speed of the French retreat than the actual fighting, hence the name Spurs.
And Scotland got involved too.
Yes, Scotland, traditionally allied with France, tried to help by invading northern England, hoping to divert English resources away from France. But they suffered a truly catastrophic defeat at the Battle of Flodden in September 1513.
That was a devastating battle for the Scots, wasn't it?
Absolutely devastating. King James V of Scotland himself was killed on the battlefield, along with a huge portion of the Scottish nobility. It effectively ended Scotland's involvement in the war completely and secured England's northern border for decades.
Okay, so with the French driven out of Italy for the moment and these parallel wars kind of wrapping up, the victorious Holy League members met at Mantua in late 1512. Time to divide the spoils, right?
Exactly. And this is precisely where the underlying, frankly impossible contradictions of the Holy League alliance burst into the open.
They managed to agree on something, didn't they? Punishing Florence.
Yes, they did manage to agree on one act of combined vengeance. Florence had hosted Louis XII's anti-papal council of Pisa, which had tried to depose Julius II. So the Spanish commander, Cardona, marched his army into Tuscany. He overthrew the Florentine Republic, which had been restored after the Medici were exiled earlier, and he installed Giuliano de' Medici, Pope Julius's own family relative, soon to be Pope Leo X's brother, as the ruler of Florence. So consensus achieved there, temporarily. Medici back in charge.
But beyond punishing Florence, the deeper divisions quickly doomed the Holy League's unity. They had completely contradictory goals for northern Italy, didn't they?
Totally contradictory. Take Milan, for example. Pope Julius II in Venice actually supported keeping Maximilian Sforza as duke. They saw him as weak, yes, but maybe a necessary buffer against future French ambitions.
Whereas the emperor in Spain,
Emperor Maximilian II and Ferdinand II of Spain wanted their own relatives installed as Duke of Milan. They were aiming for permanent Habsburg influence, not just a weak Sforza puppet.
And then there was Ferrara, the Pope's other target.
Right. Julius II absolutely demanded that Ferrara be ceded entirely to the Papal States. But Ferdinand of Spain objected violently. He argued that keeping Ferrara independent, even if weakened, was necessary to counterbalance the growing power of the Papal State itself. He didn't want the Pope getting too strong.
Fascinating. Even allies are worried about their allies' power.
Always. And most critically, Emperor Maximilian I, despite having been beaten by Venice years earlier, absolutely refused to relinquish what he still considered imperial territory. This included most of the Veneto region, the very lands Venice had recently recaptured or was still fighting to keep. He wasn't giving up his claims.
So Julius II must have been incredibly frustrated.
So frustrated, apparently, that sources say he actually threatened to revive the old League of Cambrai against Venice again. Can you imagine fighting a war for years alongside Venice against France, only to contemplate immediately reforming the original anti-Venetian alliance with the emperor because they couldn't agree on the spoils? The irony is just palpable.
It really highlights the purely transactional nature of these alliances.
Absolutely. But before Julius could act on that threat or further complicate things, the singular driving force behind this entire period of chaos, Julius II, the warrior pope, died in February 1513.
And he was succeeded by?
Pope Leo X, Giovanni de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. A very different kind of pope, more known for his patronage of the arts than his military prowess. With the warrior pope gone, The already fragile structure of the Holy League began to shake immediately.
Okay, so the death of Julius II and the clear failure of the Mantua negotiations to divide the spoils, those seem like the definitive catalysts for the next great pivot in this unbelievably complex war. Venice, seeing the Holy League basically paralyzed by its own internal contradictions.
They realized their best chance now lay elsewhere. Again, they completely abandoned the Holy League, which had failed to secure their interests, and they allied once more with their former enemy, France.
Back to France. When did this happen?
The Treaty of Blois, signed on March 23, 1513. Venice and France pledged to work together to partition northern Italy between them. Venice wanted its territory back from the emperor. France wanted Milan back.
And did Louis XII act on this immediately?
He did. He launched a fresh invasion of Milan, led this time by Louis de la Tremoille. And Maximilian Sforza, the duke installed by the Swiss, had proven deeply unpopular with the Milanese. They saw him, correctly, as little more than a puppet of his expensive Swiss mercenary garrison. So the French actually seized Milan fairly quickly. They then besieged the main Swiss force garrisoned in the town of Novara.
But the Swiss, they weren't done yet, were they? They had a reputation to uphold.
Not by a long shot. The Swiss Confederacy, who had beaten French armies repeatedly over the past decade, proved their fearsome reputation once again. At the Battle of Novara in June 1513, a Swiss relief army arrived and utterly routed the French army under La Tremoille.
Even though the French had superior numbers.
Yes, the French had more troops overall, and especially superior cavalry and artillery. But the Swiss infantry charge was just relentless. They broke the French lines. The French were pursued all the way back across the Alps. They even had to retreat from a siege on Dijon, back in France itself, after being bought off with a very large bribe by the Swiss. It was another humiliation for France.
And this defeat, it must have left Venice completely exposed again.
Completely exposed, yes. And they paid the price almost immediately. Bartolomeo d'Aviano, remember him, the Venetian general?
Mm-hmm.
His army was caught and defeated by the Spanish Holy League forces under Cardona at the Battle of La Motta in October 1513.
So the Spanish pushed deep into Venetian territory.
They did. Cardona's army advanced right up to the edge of the Venetian lagoon. They even launched a bombardment of Venice itself from the mainland. It was largely ineffective, of course, because they had no ships to actually attempt an amphibious landing, but the psychological impact must have been immense, seeing enemy cannonballs land near the city.
So the war just grinds to halt again. A stalemate.
Pretty much. The next year or so was a miserable stalemate, defined mostly by skirmishes, raiding, and general exhaustion on all sides. But then everything changed again with the death of King Louis XII of France in January 1515.
And his successor?
His successor was his young, ambitious cousin and son-in-law, Francis I. A completely different personality. Francis was only 20 years old, eager for glory, and he immediately made reclaiming Milan his absolute top priority. He saw Louis XII's recent defeats as temporary setbacks and believed control of Milan was central to French prestige and power.
So Francis renews the alliance with Venice.
Immediately, June 1515, the Franco-Venetian alliance is reaffirmed, and Francis begins assembling a massive army to invade Italy and take back Milan.
Did he learn anything from the previous French failures, particularly against the Swiss?
It seems he did, or at least he had better advice this time. His key advisor was the veteran Italian general Gian Giacomo Trivulzio, the same man who had taken Bologna for the French earlier. Trivulzio knew the Swiss were masters of defensive positions, and they had heavily fortified the traditional Alpine passes, like the Mont Cenis Pass, expecting the French to come that way.
So Trivulzio advised a different route.
He advised Francis to take a route the Swiss considered completely impassable for a large army with heavy artillery through the Stura Valley, using less known, much rougher passes.
A flanking maneuver on a massive scale.
Exactly. It was a masterstroke of logistics and strategic surprise. Francis marched his huge army, including his vital heavy artillery train, through these difficult southern passes. The main Swiss and Papal forces, sitting up north blocking the expected routes, were entirely bypassed. They were caught completely flat-footed.
Did the surprise attack yield immediate results?
It did. Francis's vanguard, moving quickly, managed to surprise and capture Prospero Colonna, the Papal commander, along with his entire staff, at Villafranca, before he even realized the French main army wasn't coming through the northern passes.
This must have set the stage for the final decisive showdown.
It absolutely did. It led directly to the final major engagement of the entire War of League of Cambrai. The Battle of Marignano, fought just southeast of Milan over 2 incredibly long, brutal days, September 13th and 14th, 1515.
Marignano. This one feels different. It feels like a turning point.
It really was a turning point, not just for this war, but arguably in military history. It was a monumental Franco-Venetian victory over the combined Swiss and Milanese forces. For decades leading up to this, the Swiss pike formations, the phalanx as it was sometimes called, had been the single most feared and consistently effective land unit in Europe. They were often called the Lords of the Battlefield. Marignano changed that.
What specifically changed that day? How did the French and Venetians overcome the Swiss dominance?
Several key factors. Francis made extremely effective use of his heavy cavalry, the French gendarmes, which they had in abundance and were heavily armored. That was critical. But the real star of the show, according to most accounts, was the French artillery.
Better artillery.
Significantly better and better employed. The French brought dozens of heavy bronze cannons, which were relatively mobile for their size. They could reposition them fairly quickly on the battlefield, and they had a much higher rate of fire than older artillery pieces. They used this artillery with unprecedented effectiveness, concentrating fire to shatter the dense Swiss pike blocks before the cavalry charged in.
So combined arms, artillery, breaking formations, cavalry exploiting the gaps.
Precisely. That combination finally broke the traditional Swiss tactical dominance. But there was another crucial element.
The Venetians.
Yes. The battle raged for 2 full days. It was incredibly fierce. Some contemporaries called it the Battle of Giants. On the second morning, the French position was still somewhat precarious. The Swiss were reforming for another attack. And just then, Bartolomeo d'Alviano arrived on the battlefield with the Venetian forces. They had been marching hard to reach the fight.
A timely arrival.
Extremely timely. Their arrival tipped the balance irrevocably. The combined Franco-Venetian force was now too much for the exhausted Swiss, who finally broke and retreated. It was a catastrophic defeat for the Swiss, shattering their aura of invincibility.
And the consequences of Marignano were immediate.
Swift and total.
Yeah.
Francis I marched into Milan and captured the city on October 4, 1515. He immediately dethroned Maximilian Sforza, sending him into exile in France. And Pope Leo X, watching from Rome, realized the game was up. His military protection of the Swiss had been decisively defeated. He knew he had to negotiate with the victorious Francis.
So the Pope surrendered.
Effectively, yes. Leo X met with Francis I in Bologna in December 1515. He was forced to cede the cities of Parma and Piacenza to the French, who added them to Milan. He also had to give Modena back to the Duke of Ferrara, Francis's ally. The Pope did manage to secure papal sovereignty over the rest of the Romagna, finally settling that long-standing issue.
And did Leo X get anything else out of it?
He got a crucial concession from Francis. French non-interference in Leo's own planned campaign against the Duke of Urbino, Francesco Maria della Rovere, the same guy who had murdered a cardinal. Leo wanted him out, and Francis agreed to look the other way. A separate political maneuver for papal consolidation.
So the war that had started with Venice being the isolated victim, attacked by everyone.
He's now ending with Francis of France and his ally Venice as the dominant victorious powers in northern Italy, an absolutely stunning turnaround over 8 years. Right, that brings us to the formal conclusion of this incredibly messy conflict and its lasting legacy. It all wraps up with the treaties of 1516. The first big step was getting Spain out of the picture.
How did that happen? There was a new king in Spain by then, wasn't there?
Yes, Ferdinand II had died. The new Spanish sovereign was the young Charles, soon-to-be Emperor Charles V, who had just inherited not only Spain but also Naples, the Netherlands, and the Habsburg lands in Austria. He was sitting on a vast, sprawling inheritance and desperately needed peace, at least temporarily, to consolidate his rule.
So he made a deal with Francis I?
He did. The Treaty of Noyon, signed in August 1516. It was essentially a pragmatic territorial swap, recognizing the reality on the ground. Charles V recognized Francis I's claim to Milan, which Francis was already occupying. In return, Francis V formally recognized Spanish claims to the Kingdom of Naples.
So it basically cemented the division of Italy, French influence in the north, Spanish influence in the south.
That's exactly what Noyon did, at least for the moment. It took Spain out of the current war and set the stage for the next phase of the Italian Wars, which would be a direct confrontation between these two young rulers, Francis and Charles.
Okay, so Spain's out. What about the Emperor Maximilian I? He still had claims, didn't he?
He did, but his last attempt to assert them had failed miserably. He'd launched one final, rather poorly funded invasion of Lombardy earlier in 1516, which Francis easily repelled. That failure seemed to finally convince Maximilian that further war against the combined Franco-Venetian power was futile. He was out of money and options.
So he finally made peace, too.
Thus, this led to the Treaty of Brussels, concluded in December of 1516. Maximilian formally accepted the French occupation of Milan. And crucially for Venice and our original narrative, the treaty confirmed Venetian claims to almost all the remaining imperial possessions in Lombardy that they had fought for. The major exception was the city of Cremona, which went to France as part of Milan. Maximilian agreed to cease all hostilities.
And the very last peace fell into place soon after.
The last contested city, Verona, which Maximilian had held onto, was formally surrendered to the Venetians in January of 1517. And with that, the 8-year War of the League of Cambrai was finally, formally over.
Which brings us back to that great paradox we talked about at the start. 8 years of massive coalition warfare, endless betrayals, huge expenditure of blood and treasure across the entire continent.
And the final settlement, particularly regarding Venice's borders on the mainland, essentially returned the map of Italy almost exactly to the status quo of 1508 before the war even began.
Venice must have been relieved, though.
Oh, ecstatic. Sources tell us Venice celebrated the peace extensively for months, from January to March 1517. They had faced annihilation and survived, recovering almost all their mainland territory, albeit minus a few strategic losses and having conceded some papal rights. But still, considering where they were in 1509, it was a remarkable recovery.
So was it all just pointless? 8 years of chaos for nothing?
Geographically, it seems almost circular, doesn't it? But politically and militarily, not at all. The war had profound consequences. It brutally exposed the fragility of papal power when faced with determined secular states. It cemented the rise of state-controlled artillery as a decisive battlefield weapon, marking the beginning of the end for the dominance of traditional infantry like the Swiss pikes. Mariana was huge in that respect.
And it set up the next big conflict?
Absolutely. Most significantly, this chaotic period with France, Spain, the Empire, and the papacy constantly switching sides firmly established the foundational rivalry that would dominate European politics for the next 40 years and arguably longer.
The big one, Valois versus Habsburg.
Exactly. The rivalry between the House of Valois and France, embodied by Francis I, and the rapidly rising, almost overwhelming power of the House of Habsburg under Charles V, who now controlled Spain, Naples, Austria, the Netherlands, and would soon be elected Holy Roman Emperor.
So the War of the League of Cambrai was like a dress rehearsal.
A brutal dress rehearsal, you could say, or maybe a training ground. It taught European powers how to conduct these large-scale, complex transnational wars. It taught them how to negotiate purely transactional alliances based on immediate self-interest rather than long-term loyalty or ideology. It perfectly set the stage for the next, even more intense phase of the Italian Wars, specifically the conflict of 1521-1526, which saw the first major head-to-head clash between Francis I and Charles V.
And looking back at the alliances themselves,
We saw crystal clearly that they were just tools built on mutual greed, like the League of Cambrai, and dismantled the instant a core interest shifted. Pope Julius II was the master of this, wasn't he? Starting the war against Venice, ending it allied with Venice against France. He proved, perhaps better than anyone, that statecraft in the early 16th century was defined not by ideology or even religion sometimes, but by raw self-interest and the driving ambition of powerful personalities.
Okay, so after charting this truly extraordinary, almost dizzying period of diplomatic chaos and constant warfare, we should probably leave our listeners with a final thought, tying together that paradox of the status quo outcome and the actual deeper legacy.
Right. Despite the unprecedented number of alliances formed and broken, despite the tremendous military effort, the innovation, the vast blood and treasure spent by almost every major European power over 8 long years.
The actual map, the land they were fighting over, ended up looking almost exactly like it did back in 1508 when the whole thing started.
So, given this incredibly circular, exhausting, and destructive outcome on the ground, how should we ultimately view the War of the League of Cambrai? Was it, in the end, a total failure of diplomacy and military effort, just a pointless, cynical, self-interested conflict? Or was it actually a necessary, if brutal, rehearsal? A painful learning process that laid the military and political groundwork for the defining conflict of the next century, the Habsburg versus Valois struggle, which would ultimately forge the map and the balance of power in modern Europe. Think about the cost sometimes of learning a truly difficult fundamental lesson on the world stage.
Welcome to the deep dive. We try to take these really tangled historical conflicts and, make them make sense, give you the core facts, the fascinating bits.
And today, we're tackling a big one, a conflict that, well, technically spanned nearly 80 years,
Yeah, 80 years. It reshaped Europe, created a global superpower out of, well, basically a handful of small provinces.
We are diving into the 80 Years' War.
Or the Dutch Revolt.
Or the Tactigearrige Oorlog, if you're Dutch.
Or the Guerre de Flanders, if you were Spanish back then. So many names.
And that name confusion really points to the heart of it. This wasn't just some local squabble in the Low Countries. Not at all.
Right.
You're seeing this huge clash, central power versus local rights. It's a key moment in the religious wars sweeping Europe.
And it feeds directly into the 30 Years' War later on, doesn't it, when things kick off again in 1621.
Exactly. But maybe the most crucial thing, we're looking at the birth certificate of the Dutch Republic, which, pretty quickly becomes this 17th century economic and cultural giant.
It's just complex from the get-go. Even the experts, our sources show they can't quite agree. When did it really start? 1566, 1568. Is it about Philip II trying to centralize everything? Or is it all about the Protestant Reformation? And should we even call it the 80 Years' War?
Look, that's what happens when you try to define a conflict that lasts generations, right? It shifts, it changes. The sources themselves, they show different angles.
Which is why some historians just prefer Dutch Revolt. Less prescriptive.
True. But our goal today, our mission, is to cut through that fog. We want to give you a clear, chronological walkthrough.
From those early Habsburg attempts to tighten control, right up to the final peace treaty, the Peace of Münster in 1648.
Yeah, digging into the politics, the religion, the military stuff,
Right.
all the dynamics that really fractured the place and shaped what came next.
Okay, so let's set the stage. The Habsburg inheritance, we're talking about the Low Countries, the 17 provinces.
Right, modern Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, bits of France, historically quite independent, these regions. They came out of the old Burgundian state.
And then they get inherited by the House of Habsburg.
And the big figure here is Charles V. I mean, this guy was arguably the most powerful ruler in Europe. King of Spain, Holy Roman Emperor.
He had his fingers in a lot of pies.
Definitely. And the Low Countries were vital to him. Strategically, economically. He had two huge goals for them, and they were kind of linked.
Okay, what were they?
First, politics. He wanted to take these really diverse, quite autonomous regions, each with its own traditions, its own privileges, and forge them into one single political unit. More centralized.
Easier to manage, I guess.
Exactly. He even formalized it with something called the Pragmatic Sanction in 1549, basically saying these 17 provinces, they stick together as one inheritance.
And the second goal, you said it was linked?
Religion. Charles was a staunch Catholic, and he was deeply worried about the Protestant Reformation spreading.
Which it was doing, right? Especially in the cities.
Oh, yeah. Among merchants, artisans. So Charles wanted religious uniformity. He brought in these really harsh anti-heresy laws, the placards, they call them.
Placards sounds harmless.
Not harmless at all. We're talking the death penalty just for having forbidden books or going to a non-Catholic church service. Really severe stuff.
Wow. Okay. But the real explosion, the conflict, that comes under his son, Philip II.
That's right. Philip inherits Spain and the Netherlands in 1555. And if anything, he's even more determined than his father. He doubles down. Centralization, crushing heresy, those are his absolute priorities.
And this didn't go down well.
Not at all. It created this huge backlash. And importantly, it wasn't just Protestants complaining. The sources are clear on this.
Oh, wow.
You had powerful Catholic nobles, big names like William of Orange, though he wasn't called the Silent yet, Count Egmont, Count Horn. These guys fiercely defended their traditional rights, the privileges of their provinces and cities.
They saw Philip's reforms as basically a Spanish takeover, imposing foreign officials, Spanish ways of doing things.
Pretty much. An attack on their power, their autonomy. So you've got this political resistance from the top bubbling up.
Okay, so political tension meets this simmering religious anger. What lit the fuse? What turned protests into actual revolt?
Well, it started relatively peacefully, actually. In 1566, you had the Compromise of Nobles. Basically a petition asking Philip to ease up on the Inquisition, the persecution.
That didn't work.
Philip wasn't really budging. And then, that summer, boom, the Beeldenstorm, the iconoclastic fury.
Yes, the image breaking.
And this wasn't just random rioting. Our sources describe it as organized. Calvinist groups systematically going into Catholic churches and destroying statues, altarpieces, stained glass, anything they saw as idolatry.
That must have terrified the authorities.
It did. The governor, Margaret of Parma, Philip's half-sister, she was worried about a full-scale uprising. She actually made some temporary concessions to the Calvinists, trying to calm things down.
But the fighting had already started by then.
Small scale, yes. Late 1566, early 1567, you see the first actual military clashes. Calvinist rebels versus Habsburg government forces. But Philip II's response, that was on a whole different level.
He wasn't interested in concession.
Absolutely not. He decided only force would work. He replaced Margaret with Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the Duke of Alva, a tough, experienced general.
And he didn't come alone.
No way. Alba arrived in 1567 with the Army of Flanders. 10,000 elite Spanish and Italian soldiers. Battle-hardened veterans. Their mandate was crystal clear. Crush the rebellion, root out heresy, stamp out any political opposition, period.
And Alba got straight to work. He set up this infamous Council of Troubles.
Which everyone immediately nicknamed the Blood Council, and for good reason.
Because?
It was basically an emergency court operating outside the normal legal system. Its job was to prosecute anyone involved in the revolt or the iconoclasm. High status, low status, didn't matter.
So, mass arrests, trials.
Thousands were summoned. Hundreds were executed, including those high-ranking Catholic nobles we mentioned, Egmont and Horn, publicly beheaded in Brussels in 1568. A huge shock.
What about William of Orange, the other big noble?
He'd managed to escape into exile. He tried to launch an invasion in 1568 to rally support, but it fizzled out. Alba's grip was too strong. William had to retreat again.
So, for a couple of years there, say 1569 to 1571, it looked like Alba had won, like the revolt was over.
It really did seem that way. The sources suggest a period of, well, grim quiet. Alba was firmly in control.
But why didn't that last? If he'd crushed the opposition, why did it flare up again even worse?
Two big reasons, really. First, the sheer severity of his rule just kept breeding resentment. But second, and maybe even more important, were his fiscal policies, his taxes.
Money. Always follow the money.
Absolutely. Alba needed to pay for this massive army occupying the country, and he wanted the locals to foot the bill. So he tried to introduce these new taxes based on Spanish models. The big one was the 10th penny, a 10% tax on all sales of movable goods. Think of it like a sales tax, but huge. There was also a 20th penny on property sales.
10% on everything you sell. That would hit trade hard.
Devastatingly hard. This was a direct assault on the economic lifeblood of the cities, the merchants. And crucially, it bypassed the traditional rights of the provinces and cities, who always insisted on approving their own taxes through their own assemblies.
So he wasn't just alienating Protestants and rebellious nobles anymore. He was hitting the pockets of, well, pretty much everyone, even loyal Catholics.
Precisely. The Inquisition, the executions, abolishing privileges, and these crippling taxes. Alba basically managed to unite almost everyone against Spanish rule, even if they didn't realize it yet. The sources say he made the whole region susceptible to rebellion. He put out the first fire, but he'd soaked the whole place in gasoline for the next one.
And that next fire catches in 1572. This year is often seen as the real start of the wider rebellion, isn't it? The turning point.
Absolutely. 1572 is pivotal. And it starts almost by accident. Not with some grand invasion plan, but with pirates.
Pirates? You mean the sea beggars, the water douzen?
Exactly. These were basically privateers, many of them exiled Calvinists. They'd been raiding Spanish shipping, often using English ports as bases.
But then England kicked them out.
Right. Queen Elizabeth wanted to cool tensions with Spain, so she expelled them in early 1572. Suddenly, they needed a new base, and fast. So on April 1st, 1572, they sailed into the mouth of the Meuse River and just seized the coastal town of Brielle. It was barely defended.
April Fool's Day. You couldn't make it up.
You really couldn't. But the impact was no joke. Capturing Brielle sent this shockwave across the provinces.
It showed the Spanish weren't invincible.
Exactly. It gave the rebels a physical foothold on land, a symbol. And it just energized the resistance everywhere, especially in Holland and Zealand.
William of Orange saw his chance.
He did. He launched his second invasion, this time aiming specifically to capitalize on the widespread hatred of Alba's regime, the taxes, the repression.
And towns started flipping, joining the revolt.
Dozens of them, especially in Holland and Zealand. They declared for William, recognized him as their stadtholder, their governor, effectively rejecting Alba's authority.
Okay, so Alba's reaction must have been furious.
Predictably swift and brutal. He sent his son, Don Frederic, with the army to crush this new wave of rebellion. And their strategy was basically terror.
Right. This is where we get into the Spanish atrocities. It's important to talk about this because it really shapes what comes next.
It's crucial. Don Fredric's campaign was designed to make examples, to terrify other towns into submission.
What kind of examples?
Well, Mechlin was sacked and looted horribly. Zutphen suffered a similar fate. And then there was Naarden.
Naarden. What happened there?
After a brief siege, the Spanish promised the citizens mercy if they surrendered. They surrendered. The Spanish troops then entered the town and massacred almost the entire population. Men, women, children. Deliberate, calculated slaughter.
Just unbelievable cruelty, to make a point.
Precisely. To say, this is what happens if you defy us. And this campaign rolled on towards the heart of the revolt in Holland. It culminated in the Siege of Haarlem.
Which lasted a long time, didn't it?
7 agonizing months. Through the winter of 1572 into 1573, grueling fighting, huge casualties on both sides, starvation inside the city.
But Haarlem eventually fell.
It did. In July 1573, the garrison surrendered, hoping for terms. But again, many were executed. Another sack followed. It was a major blow to the rebels, shrinking their territories significantly.
So at this point, the revolt is basically pushed back into just Holland and Zeeland.
Pretty much, those watery, defensible provinces. And the people there knew, after Naarden and Haarlem, that surrender wasn't an option. It meant death or ruin. So they were determined to fight on, whatever the cost.
But the Spanish advance kind of ran out of steam after Haarlem, right?
But it did. Sieges like Haarlem were incredibly costly for the Spanish, too, in men and money. And the Dutch were getting better at fighting back, especially at sea. They controlled the waterways, which was vital in that landscape.
They had successes, too.
Oh, yes. They managed to relieve the siege of Alkmaar, famously shouting, "Victory begins at Alkmaar." They won the Battle of Delft. They were achieving naval dominance along the coast. The Spanish offensive stalled.
And this is when Alba finally leaves.
Yes, in December 1573. He cited ill health, but the reality was the war wasn't won. It was incredibly expensive, and Madrid was probably losing patience.
His successor, Louis de Requesens, tried a different tactic. More conciliation.
He did offer some concessions, tried to abolish the hated 10th penny tax, but he couldn't break the military stalemate. He famously failed to take Leiden in 1574.
Ah, the Siege of Leiden. That's where the Dutch cut the dikes, right?
That's the one. Flooded the whole countryside to let their relief fleet sail right up to the city walls. A huge symbolic victory for the rebels. But the real game changer, the event that finally united everyone, wasn't a battle. It was a financial meltdown.
Spain went bankrupt. Again. Or for the first time.
The big one. November 1575. Philip II's government declared state bankruptcy, despite all the silver coming from the Americas.
They just couldn't afford this war in the Netherlands and all their other commitments.
Exactly. Maintaining that huge army of Flanders, fighting the Ottomans, other European entanglements.
Yeah.
It drained the treasury. And bankruptcy meant one critical thing.
The soldiers didn't get paid.
Bingo. And these Spanish and Italian soldiers were professionals. They fought for pay. No pay. Big problem. Widespread mutinies broke out.
And they didn't just sit around complaining.
No. They took matters into their own hands. This period is known as the Spanish Fury. Unpaid, leaderless soldiers started looting and rampaging through the provinces, including the ones that had remained loyal to Spain.
So the king's own troops were attacking his loyal subjects.
That's the devastating irony. The worst example, the absolute nadir, was the sack of Antwerp in November 1576.
Antwerp was the richest city, wasn't it? The financial center.
Absolutely. And the mutinying Spanish troops subjected it to days of horrific violence, looting, burning, killing thousands of civilians. It was an atrocity that horrified everyone, Catholic and Protestant, loyalist and rebel alike.
And that was the final straw.
That was it. The sack of Antwerp galvanized the entire country. Suddenly, the enemy wasn't just heresy or distant political control. It was the uncontrolled violence of the king's own army right there on their doorstep.
This led directly to the pacification of Ghent.
Directly. In November 1576. For the first and only time, almost all 17 provinces, everyone except tiny Luxembourg, came together. They formed a united political and military front.
What did they demand?
3 core things. 1, get these foreign Spanish troops out immediately. 2, stop the religious persecution. 3, consult the States General, their traditional representative assembly, on how the country should be governed. It was a remarkable moment of unity born out of shared fear and outrage.
So for a moment there, with the pacification of Ghent, it actually looked like peace might be possible, a unified Netherlands negotiating with the king.
It seemed possible, yeah. The new royal governor, Don Juan of Austria, Philip II's half-brother, famous Victor of Lepanto, he arrived and actually negotiated the Edict of 1577.
And that edict accepted the pacification's demands, like getting the troops out.
Nominally, yes. It agreed to the withdrawal of foreign troops, which was the big one. And the provinces themselves tried to cement this unity with something called the First Union of Brussels in 1577.
What was that about?
It basically reaffirmed the pacification, but also made a point of confirming Catholicism as the main religion, trying to reassure the more conservative provinces. So, for a few months, maybe it looked like they might reach a settlement. Philip II still king, but with local rights restored.
But alliances built on fear, they tend to be fragile.
Extremely fragile.
Mm.
As soon as the immediate threat of the mutinying troops seemed to recede slightly, the underlying tensions just came right back to the surface.
And Don Juan didn't really stick to the agreement, did he?
Not for long. In mid-1577, he seized the strategic citadel of Namur, kind of breaking the truce, and launched a new military offensive.
Which went badly for the rebels.
Very badly. The Battle of Gembloux in early 1578 was a crushing defeat for the state's general's army. It really shook confidence and got some provinces thinking maybe they should just cut a deal with Spain after all.
But Gembloux wasn't the only thing tearing the United Front apart, was it? There was internal religious conflict, too.
Oh, absolutely. This became critical. While the provinces were trying to fight Spain, radical Calvinists took control in several key cities, most notably Ghent.
They set up their own Calvinist republic in Ghent.
They did. And they started doing exactly what they accused the Spanish of doing, persecuting Catholics, seizing church property, smashing religious images again, extreme intolerance.
Which must have horrified their Catholic allies in the pacification.
Completely. Remember, many southern nobles and provinces had joined the pacification primarily to get rid of the mutinous Spanish troops and protect their traditional privileges. They were staunchly Catholic and loyal to the king. This Calvinist radicalism was absolutely not what they signed up for.
They became known as the malcontents.
That's the term, yes. These alienated Catholic nobles and provinces felt caught between Spanish overreach and Calvinist extremism. And this division presented a golden opportunity for Spain.
Enter the Duke of Parma, Alexander Farnese.
Exactly. Don Juan died suddenly in late 1578, and Parma took over as governor-general. And Parma was brilliant. Militarily capable, yes, but also a shrewd diplomat.
He saw he could split the opposition.
Precisely. He realized he couldn't defeat all 17 united provinces. But he could peel away the disillusioned Catholic malcontents. He opened negotiations with them.
What did he offer them?
He promised to respect their traditional privileges, uphold the Catholic faith exclusively in their regions, and crucially, ensure the withdrawal of foreign troops from their territories if they returned to royal obedience.
And they took the deal.
They did. In January 1579, the southernmost provinces Artois and Hainaut and the city of Douai signed the Union of Arras. They declared their loyalty to Philip II and effectively abandoned the general revolt. A few months later, they signed a separate peace treaty with the king. The United Front was broken.
So the South breaks away. What did the remaining provinces in the North and Center do?
They responded almost immediately. Later that same month, January 1579, the mostly northern Dutch-speaking provinces formed their own alliance, the Union of Utrecht.
This was different from Arras, obviously.
Totally different foundation. Arras was about loyalty to the king and Catholicism. Utrecht was about continued resistance to Spain, mutual defense, and establishing some form of religious tolerance, though, in practice, Calvinism quickly became dominant in the north.
And the Union of Utrecht, that basically becomes the constitution of the future Dutch Republic.
It's the foundational document, yes.
Yeah.
It laid out how these provinces would cooperate militarily and politically. But crucially, even after forming the Union of Utrecht, they hadn't formally ditched Philip II as their king, yet.
That came next.
That came in 1581, a landmark moment, the Act of Abjuration. In Dutch, the Plakat van Verlating.
The placard of desertion? What did it say?
It was revolutionary for its time. It didn't just say, we're independent now. It laid out a whole political theory justifying why they could depose their king.
Based on what?
They argued that a ruler has a contract with his people. He's supposed to protect their rights and freedoms. Philip II, they said, had consistently violated their ancient privileges, acted like a tyrant, and therefore had forfeited his right to rule them. They drew on old Burgundian legal ideas about resistance to tyranny.
So they declared the throne vacant. We're kicking you out, Philip.
Essentially, yes. A formal declaration of independence, grounded in political theory. Now, the problem was, who would rule instead?
Right. They needed a new sovereign. Did they find one easily?
Not at all. The next 7 years were politically chaotic for the new state. They shopped around for a replacement monarch.
Who did they try?
Well, they offered the job to Matthias of Austria, the Holy Roman Emperor's brother. That didn't work out. Then they tried Francis, Duke of Anjou, the brother of the French king.
How did that go?
Disaster. Anjou tried to seize more power for himself, even attacking Antwerp in 1583, the infamous French Fury. He was quickly kicked out.
What about William of Orange, their leader?
He was offered sovereignty too. But then, tragically, he was assassinated in Delft in 1584 by a Catholic fanatic loyal to Philip II. A huge blow.
They even tried getting the English involved.
Yes. Queen Elizabeth I sent troops under Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, as Governor General. But that also ended badly, with clashes over authority and strategy. Leicester left in 1587.
So they tried an Austrian, a Frenchman, their own leader got killed, they tried an Englishman. They were running out of options.
They really were. It seemed like nobody suitable wanted the job or could do it effectively, so they made a radical decision.
What was that?
In 1588, guided by legal arguments put forward in the deduction of Ronken, the States General essentially said, you know what, forget finding a king or queen, we'll govern ourselves.
As a republic?
As a republic,
Right.
led by the provincial states and the States General. It was almost unprecedented in Europe at the time for a major state to be a republic. The Dutch Republic was born out of necessity, out of the failure to find a monarch.
But while all this political searching and deciding was happening in the north, Parma wasn't just sitting back in the south, was he?
Not a chance. Parma was relentlessly continuing his military campaign. And he was incredibly successful. He was a master of siege warfare.
Taking back cities that had joined the revolt.
Systematically, he retook major centers like Bruges, Ghent, Brussels, and the biggest prize of all, Antwerp.
The fall of Antwerp in 1585, that must have been devastating for the rebels.
Huge blow. Strategically, economically, psychologically. Antwerp had been the economic engine. Its fall confirmed Spanish control over the south and led to a massive exodus of Protestant merchants and skilled workers, many of whom fled north to cities like Amsterdam, ironically fueling the future Dutch Golden Age.
So, by 1588, when the north decides to become a republic, the military situation looked pretty dire for them.
Absolutely dire. Parma had reconquered vast swaths of territory. The Republic was basically pushed back to its core northern provinces, Holland, Zeeland, Utrecht, Friesland. It looked like it was only a matter of time before Parma finished the job. The war seemed almost lost for the Dutch.
Okay, so the Republic is born in 1588, but militarily, they're on the ropes. Parma seems unstoppable. Yet the next decade, roughly 1588 to 1598, is called the 10 years, and it's seen as this major turnaround for the Dutch. What happened? How did they survive?
They got lucky. Well, not just lucky, they capitalized brilliantly on Spain's strategic blunders and shifting priorities. Two massive things happened.
Of course.
The Spanish Armada, 1588. Its defeat wasn't just a blow to Spanish prestige, it seriously hampered Spain's ability to reinforce and resupply its troops in the Netherlands by sea. Control of the sea lanes became even more crucial, and the Dutch were good at that.
Okay, the Armada. What was the second thing? Even more critical, you said.
Yes. In 1589, Philip II made a fateful decision. He ordered Parma, his best general, to take the bulk of the experienced army of Flanders and intervene in the French wars of religion.
Why?
To stop the Protestant Henry of Navarre, the future Henry IV, from becoming King of France. Philip prioritized keeping France Catholic over finishing the reconquest of the Netherlands. He diverted his main weapon at the critical moment.
Wow. So Parma and his crack troops were pulled away from fighting the Dutch.
Exactly. It gave the Dutch Republic breathing room, precious time and space they desperately needed, and they used it incredibly effectively.
This is where Maurice of Orange comes into his own. William the Silent Son.
Yes, Maurice, along with his cousin William Louis of Nassau-Dillenburg, the Stadtholder of Friesland. These two were military innovators, real students of warfare, ancient and modern.
What did they do? They reformed the army.
Radically. They introduced intense, standardized drill and discipline. The famous Dutch drill manuals were copied across Europe. They improved logistics, paid their soldiers regularly, which was key for morale, and avoiding mutinies like the Spanish Fury.
And tactics.
Big changes. They broke down the large, unwieldy infantry, blocks the Spanish tercios, into smaller, more flexible units that could maneuver faster and deliver more continuous fire. And they became absolute masters of siege warfare, using engineering and artillery systematically to take cities.
So Maurice wasn't just winning battles, he was changing how armies fought, helped invent modern warfare in a way.
You could definitely argue that. He professionalized the army. And with Parma distracted in France, Maurice went on the offensive.
Taking back territory Parma had conquered.
Precisely. Systematically. The list of successes during these 10 years is impressive. Breda was retaken in 1590 with a clever trick involving a peat boat. Zutphen, Deventer, Nijmegen fell in 1591. Stanwijk, Koeverden. The final piece was Groningen in 1594, which secured the northeast.
So these campaigns essentially drew the map of the modern Netherlands.
Largely, yes. They secured the borders of the Republic in the north and east, creating a definite core territory. This military success gave the Republic credibility.
Leading to international recognition.
Right. France and England, who were also fighting Spain, formally recognized the Dutch Republic as an independent state in 1596 with the Triple Alliance. Big diplomatic win.
And this is also when they start looking overseas, the beginnings of the Dutch Empire.
Exactly. With Spain weakened and Portugal under Spanish rule since 1580, the Dutch saw an opportunity. They started aggressively attacking Portuguese trading posts and colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The VOC, the Dutch East India Company, is founded just after this period in 1602.
Okay, so the 10 years were a period of huge success for the Dutch. What about the decade after that leading up to 1609?
That period, roughly 1599 to 1609, settles into more of a stalemate. Both sides were increasingly exhausted, especially financially.
Still fighting, though.
Oh yeah, there were major battles. Maurice won a hard-fought tactical victory against the Spanish at Newport in 1600, but it didn't lead to major strategic gains.
And the Spanish had successes, too. Ostend.
The siege of Ostend was epic. It lasted over 3 years, from 1601 to 1604. Incredibly bloody, hundreds of thousands of casualties combined. Spain eventually took the city, or what was left of it, but at a ruinous cost.
So, more grinding, costly warfare. Any decisive moments?
The Dutch scored a major naval victory in 1607, destroying a Spanish fleet at the Battle of Gibraltar. But the real driver towards peace, or at least a pause, was money. Or the lack of it.
Spain went bankrupt again.
Yep, 1607. Their third major state bankruptcy during this whole period. They simply couldn't afford to keep fighting at this intensity everywhere. The Dutch were feeling the strain too. The war was incredibly expensive.
So exhaustion and empty coffers finally forced them to talk.
Pretty much. Negotiations began, and this led to the 12 years truce, signed in Antwerp in 1609, scheduled to last until 1621.
This truce. It wasn't a final peace, but it was a big deal, right?
Huge, especially for the Dutch. It was a massive diplomatic victory, largely engineered by the advocate of Holland, Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, the Republic's leading civilian statesman.
Why was it such a big win for them?
Because in the terms of the truce, Spain formally recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic, at least for the duration of the truce. For Spain, this was incredibly humiliating.
The Habsburg superpower acknowledging these rebels as a legitimate state.
Exactly. A major blow to Spanish prestige. Philip III had to swallow it. And the terms were tough for Spain, too.
Like what?
The Dutch insisted on keeping the river Scheldt closed to traffic. This strangled trade to Antwerp, which was still under Spanish rule, and cemented Amsterdam's rise as the dominant port.
Ouch. What else?
Spain also had to implicitly accept Dutch trading activities in the East and West Indies, in areas Spain and Portugal considered their exclusive zones. It was basically Spain admitting they couldn't stop the Dutch colonial expansion.
Okay, so the Republic gets this amazing truce, international recognition, economic advantages. You'd think this would be a period of calm and consolidation for them.
You would think. But, ironically, peace abroad led to intense conflict at home. The truce period saw a major internal political crisis erupt in the Republic.
Between who?
Between the two main power centers that had emerged. On one side, you had Johan van Oldenbarnevelt, representing the powerful merchant oligarchs of Holland and the authority of the civilian States General. On the other, you had Maurice of Orange, the military hero, the stadtholder, supported by the army, and the more religiously hardline elements.
What were they fighting about? Ostensibly, it was religion, right?
Yeah, the trigger was a theological dispute within Calvinism. The Remonstrants, or Arminians, were more moderate, arguing for less strict predestination and more state influence over the church. Oldenbarnevelt and the urban regents tended to back them.
And the other side?
The Counter-Remonstrants, or Gomarists, were strict Orthodox Calvinists, insisting on rigid doctrine and church autonomy. Maurice sided strongly with them, as did many ordinary people and the other provinces jealous of Holland's dominance.
But it wasn't just about theology, was it? It was really a power struggle.
Absolutely, the sources make that clear. It was about who ultimately ran the country. The civilian regents led by Holland, or the military stadtholder backed by the army and the Orthodox Church. Federalism versus centralization, almost.
How bad did it get?
It got very ugly. It nearly tipped into civil war. Oldenbarnevelt persuaded the states of Holland to raise their own provincial troops, the Woordgelders, to maintain order, which Maurice saw as a direct challenge to the federal army's authority.
So Maurice acted.
He did. He used the federal army to disband the Woordgelders, purge remonstrant magistrates from city councils, and effectively stage a coup. A national church meeting, the Synod of Dort, 1618, 1619, formally condemned Remonstrant theology.
And what happened to Oldenbarnevelt, the guy who got them the truce?
Arrested,
Yeah.
tried for treason on dubious charges, and executed in The Hague in 1619. A shocking end for the Republic's elder statesman.
Wow, so Maurice won the power struggle decisively.
Totally. His allies, like the great legal thinker Hugo Grotius, who was a Remonstrant, were imprisoned. The crisis was resolved violently, just as the 12 years' truce was nearing its end. The Republic had sorted out its internal power structure just in time for the war with Spain to start again. So, 1621 arrives, the truce runs out, attempts to negotiate a permanent peace treaty failed. Everyone pretty much expected the war to resume, and it did.
And this final phase, 1621 to 1648, it happens right slap bang in the middle of the 30 Years' War that's tearing apart the Holy Roman Empire and much of Europe.
Exactly. The Dutch conflict essentially becomes a major theater within that wider European catastrophe. They weren't isolated anymore.
How linked were the two wars? Were they fighting the same enemies?
Deeply intertwined, but not exactly the same war. The Dutch were still primarily focused on Spain, but Spain was now also heavily involved in the 30 Years' War, supporting the Holy Roman Emperor, who was also a Habsburg.
So Spain's resources were stretched even thinner.
Hugely, which benefited the Dutch enormously. On the flip side, Spain sometimes got military help from imperial forces sent to the Netherlands. So alliances shifted, but the core Dutch-Spanish fight continued.
What did this last phase of fighting look like? More sieges?
Lots more sieges. It was a real back-and-forth, grinding war of attrition, mainly focused on capturing key fortified towns and controlling strategic river lines.
Spain had some success early on. They retook Breda.
They did, in 1625. A big morale boost for Spain, famously captured in Velázquez's painting, The Surrender of Breda. But it didn't fundamentally change the strategic situation for long.
Because the Dutch, now under Maurice's successor, Frederick Henry, pushed back.
Frederick Henry proved to be a very capable commander, too. The Dutch army was arguably at its peak efficiency. They started capturing key strongholds along the eastern and southern borders.
Like where?
Oldenzaal in 1626, Groenland in 1627. The really big one was Hertogenbosch Den Bosch in 1629.
Why was Hertogenbosch so important?
It was a major, heavily fortified Catholic city deep in Brabant. Capturing it was a huge strategic and psychological victory for the Dutch. It opened up the possibility of pushing further south.
And they did, along the Meuse River.
Yes. In 1632, they took Venlo, Roermond, and critically, Maastricht. These campaigns secured the Republic's southern frontier and created what became known as the Generality Lands.
Generality lands, what were those?
These were the conquered territories in Brabant, Flanders, and Limburg that weren't incorporated as full provinces into the Republic, partly because they were predominantly Catholic. They were ruled directly by the States General in The Hague.
So the Dutch were making steady progress. Did they retake Breda eventually?
They did in 1637, another major success for Frederick Henry. It really seemed like the momentum was with the Dutch, but they sometimes overreached.
Like the invasion of the southern Netherlands with France.
Ah yes, 1635, that was supposed to be the killer blow. France had formally entered the 30 Years' War against Spain, and they allied with the Dutch for a joint invasion. The plan was to conquer the Spanish Netherlands and partition it between them.
Sounds like a winning plan. What went wrong?
Pretty much everything. Coordination between the French and Dutch armies was poor. Logistics were a mess. But the biggest disaster was political.
How so?
The invading troops, particularly the French, but also some Dutch soldiers, behaved brutally. They sacked the town of Tienen, massacring civilians.
Oh no, not again.
Exactly. It completely alienated the population of the southern Netherlands. Any lingering hope that the largely Catholic South might welcome the Dutch as liberators from Spain just evaporated. They saw the invaders as just as bad, if not worse. The invasion fizzled out.
So that attempt to finish the war failed. What was happening on the Spanish side? They must have been feeling the pressure.
Immense pressure. The war was cripplingly expensive. And now, with France fully engaged, Spain was fighting on multiple fronts. Critically, a major revolt broke out within Spain itself, the Reapers' War in Catalonia, actively backed by France.
So Spain had to choose its priorities.
They had to. And faced with losing potentially parts of the Iberian Peninsula itself, Filtefuth and his chief minister Olivares made a historic shift. They effectively abandoned the centuries-old Netherlands First policy. Holding on to Catalonia became more important than pouring endless resources into retaking the northern Netherlands.
That must have been a huge psychological shift for Spain, basically admitting defeat in the north.
It signaled the end game, really. Military exhaustion on both sides. Spain's internal problems, the Dutch wanting to consolidate their gains and get formal, permanent recognition. All these factors pushed them back towards peace talks in the mid-1640s.
Which brings us finally to the Peace of Münster in 1648. These talks were part of the huge peace congress trying to end the 30 Years' War, right? The Peace of Westphalia.
That's right. The negotiations involving the Dutch Republic and Spain took place in Münster, while other negotiations happened in nearby Osnabrück. It was all part of this massive diplomatic effort to redraw the map of Europe.
How did the Dutch-Spanish negotiations go? Smoothly.
Painstakingly slow. The Dutch sent a surprisingly large delegation, 8 delegates.
Why so many?
The sources suggest it reflected the deep distrust between the Dutch provinces themselves. Holland didn't trust Zeeland's interests. Gelderland didn't trust Utrecht's. Everyone wanted their own man at the table, ensuring their specific concerns were met. Internal politics, even at the finish line.
What were the main points they finally agreed on? Was it just the old truce terms made permanent?
Largely, yes. The core of the treaty text was heavily based on the 12 years truce from 1609. But this time, it was final. Spain definitively, irrevocably recognized the full sovereignty and independence of the United Provinces, the Dutch Republic.
And the other Dutch demands? The Scheldt colonies.
All met. The closure of the Scheldt was confirmed, sealing Antwerp's fate and Amsterdam's dominance. Spain formally ceded territories the Dutch had conquered overseas from the Portuguese, who were still technically under Spanish rule until 1640, but the principle held, in the East Indies and Brazil. All Spanish trade embargoes against the Dutch were lifted. It was a comprehensive victory for the Republic.
There was a weird wrinkle with France, though. The Dutch made a separate peace.
Yes. France and Spain were still fighting each other elsewhere, and France kept trying to stall the Westphalia talks to gain more leverage. The Dutch got impatient. They decided, along with Spain, to finalize their own peace treaty separately in January 1648, breaking it off from the main negotiations.
The French must have been furious, their ally cutting a deal behind their back.
They were annoyed, yes, but the Dutch prioritized securing their own hard-won independence.
Did all the Dutch provinces agree to ratify it?
Almost. 5 provinces ratified quickly. The stadtholder, William II, Frederick Henry's son, actually advised against it, thinking they could get even more if they kept fighting alongside France. And the province of Zeeland held out for a while.
Why Zeeland?
They were major beneficiaries of the Scheldt closure and privateering against Spanish shipping. Peace wasn't necessarily in their immediate economic interest. But eventually, the treaty was ratified on May 15, 1648, even without Zeeland's formal consent initially.
And this peace also formally took the Dutch Republic out of the Holy Roman Empire.
Yes, that was another key part of the Westphalia settlement. The Republic, like the Swiss cantons, gained formal independence from the HRE, confirming a de facto separation that had existed for a long time.
And the final symbolic act, the date they chose to announce it.
Ah, yes. That's incredibly telling. The States General deliberately chose to have the peace solemnly proclaimed and celebrated on June 5, 1648.
Why June 5th?
Because June 5, 1648 was the exact 80th anniversary of the day the Duke of Alba had executed Counts Egmont and Horn back in 1568.
Wow. Talk about sending a message.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A conscious, deliberate, dramatic bookend, signaling that the repression that started it all had been answered 80 years later to the day, with the final triumph and recognized independence of the Republic. The 80 years wasn't just a duration, it was a statement.
So the Peace of Münster is signed, proclaimed on that symbolic date. The war is finally over. And the old Habsburg Netherlands, which Charles V tried so hard to unify, is now definitively split.
Permanently split. You have 2 distinct entities emerging. In the north, the independent, Protestant-dominated Dutch Republic. In the south, the Spanish Netherlands, roughly modern Belgium and Luxembourg, remaining under Catholic Habsburg rule, loyal to Madrid.
And these 2 entities went down completely different paths afterwards.
Totally divergent fates. For Spain and the southern Netherlands, the war had been devastating. Decades of fighting on their soil left them financially drained, depopulated in many areas, and economically overshadowed. They entered a period of relative political and economic decline.
Well, then
The North exploded. The Dutch Republic entered its golden ewe, the Dutch Golden Age. Having secured independence and favorable trade terms, like the Scheldt closure boosting Amsterdam, they became the dominant global commercial power for much of the 17th century.
we're talking banking, shipping, the huge trading companies like the VOC.
Exactly. Science, art, think Rembrandt, Vermeer philosophy, shipbuilding, incredible prosperity, at least for the merchant classes and the elites. It wasn't equal, of course. The sources remind us there was still poverty and ongoing internal religious tensions. But compared to the South, it was night and day.
It's amazing how that conflict forged such different outcomes. And even today, historians are still arguing about the war itself, aren't they? It's not all settled history.
Not by a long shot. It remains a really fertile ground for debate. The historiography is full of controversies.
Like the name and the dates, we touched on that. Did it really last 80 years continuously?
Right. Or was it, as we've kind of laid out, maybe two distinct major wars, one from the 1560s to 1609, then the truce, then another war from 1621 to 1648 linked by the underlying issues? It's a valid question about periodization.
And the fundamental cause, that's still debated too. Religion versus politics.
Vigorously. Was it primarily a religious conflict, part of the wider Reformation, driven by Calvinists fighting for freedom of worship against Catholic repression? Or was it fundamentally a political struggle about defending traditional provincial rights, noble privileges, and urban autonomy against Habsburg centralization?
Can it be both?
Most modern historians would say yes, absolutely. The two were deeply intertwined. You needed the political grievances of the elites to provide leadership and structure, but you probably needed the religious fervor of Calvinism to provide the popular mobilization and the willingness to fight to the death. Different sources emphasize different aspects.
What about the nature of the war itself? Civil war, war of independence, religious war?
All of the above, at different times and for different groups. It started arguably as a civil conflict within the Habsburg Netherlands, morphed into a war of secession and independence for the North, and was always deeply colored by religious antagonism.
And the whole issue of the Spanish Black legend, the anti-Spanish propaganda.
That's another big one. How much was the portrayal of Spanish cruelty, Alba's blood council, the sacks of cities, the Inquisition objective reporting, and how much was deliberate Protestant propaganda designed to demonize Spain across Europe?
Where do historians land on that now?
There's a balance. While acknowledging the existence and effectiveness of the Black Legend propaganda, most historians agree that the Spanish military did commit significant atrocities, often as calculated acts of policy to suppress the revolt. The debate is more about scale, context, and how uniquely Spanish that brutality was compared to other armies of the time.
And finally, the war's role in creating distinct national identities, Dutch and Belgian.
Absolutely fundamental. The political split, reinforced by religious differences, Protestant North, Catholic South, cemented over decades of separation, led directly to the divergent paths that eventually resulted in the modern nations of the Netherlands and Belgium. The war drew the line. Hashtag tag outro.
What a journey. 80 years condensed. We went from those early tensions under Charles V and Philip II through the Beeldenstorm lighting the fuse, Alba's crackdown, the accidental spark at Brielle,
the horrors of the Spanish fury leading to that brief moment of unity with the pacification of Ghent, only for it to shatter with the unions of Arras and Utrecht.
Then the North's desperate search for a king, deciding to go it alone as a republic, surviving Parma thanks to the Armada and France.
Maurice's military revolution, the controversial truce, Oldenbarneveldt's fall, and then that final grinding phase alongside the 30 Years' War, culminating in recognition at Münster.
When you lay it out like that, the big takeaway, the aha moment maybe, is that it wasn't just one long 80-year slog with everyone on the same side throughout.
Exactly. That narrative doesn't quite fit the evidence. It was more like a widespread initial revolt that actually failed and fractured by 1579. Then, a smaller, more cohesive group in the North managed to forge a new state, the Republic.
And they survived and eventually thrived because they were resilient, innovative, and because Spain got distracted and exhausted.
That's a huge part of it. The Republic capitalized brilliantly on Spain's overcommitment and eventual financial collapse. They won independence as much through Spanish fatigue as through their own victories, perhaps.
Which leads to a fascinating final thought, something for you, the listener, to maybe chew on. We saw the Peace of Münster in 1648 largely just confirmed what was already agreed in the 12 Years' Truce back in 1609. Spain formally recognized Dutch independence then, albeit temporarily.
It was a huge humiliation for Spain in 1609. But what if Philip III had just accepted it as permanent then? Swallowed his pride, cut his losses 39 years earlier, before the Republic's internal conflict during the truce, before those final, costly 27 years of war resumed in 1621.
How different might things look? What about the southern Netherlands, still tied to a declining Spain for another century and a half after 1648? Could they have had a different fate?
Could that permanent split have been avoided, or maybe look different? That 80-year duration, bookended by that execution anniversary. It feels like a deliberate historical statement made after the fact. The real legacy, perhaps, isn't just the fighting, but that final defiant proclamation of victory and sovereignty on their own terms.